Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is story about what if Naruto was the grandchildren of Hashirama Senju and inherits his power part 1. Before I start, please do support for more amazing content and comments for part 2. Do consider to subscribe my channel and share my video to your friends and check out the description as well. Let's start the video. 12 years before the Second Great Shinobi War. What's in a name? What did names even mean? Why did they matter? Those questions had meant little to him in his first life. He'd been named Victor, a simple strong name that any man could be proud of. It led to a lot of Victor Von Doom jokes, but he'd long acknowledged that those jokes were entirely a consequence of his own actions. After all, he'd been the one to make the choice to hang out with the 12 people in 1,000 who knew that the famous MCU villain had a name as common as Victor. In this world, however, in his second life, for lack of a better term, things could not be more different. His name was a million things in one. A statement to others, and a warning to him. Hashirama Senju. The triumph, his first name translated into. An innocuous enough name if one didn't consider the context. His mother, Hinori Hyuga, the twin sister to the Hyuga clan had chosen to bestow the name on him because he'd been born on precisely the day that the news returned to Konoha that the Great Shinobi War had come to an end. Even in his thoughts, he did not dare to refer to it as the First War. When he'd called it such, it was only his age that saved him from a spontaneous lynching in the crowd of grieving parents, spouses, and children. His name and his blood, as well. Whether he carried the stereotypical Senju looks or not, little could be done to deny the fact that he was the grandnephew of the second Hokage, Tobirama Senju. Pay attention, his minder hissed at him, and he nodded, looking down at the crowd of mourners. That was what had brought his thoughts to his age. Once again, the festival of remembrance had come about, and this time, like all others, he was forced to attend dressed in a mournful sober black and forced to maintain a sober contemplative expression. He chanced a glance to the side and noted his older cousin looking boldly bored out of her mind. A 15-year-old Tsunade Senju was a force of stubborn energy that could not be denied. She'd thrown a stinker at being summoned to stand at the same position she'd occupied in every procession. The same stinker she threw last year, and the year before that. Regardless, she stood. She made it clear she didn't want to be here, but that was the best that she could do. A cough drew his attention to the man that forced the stubborn slug summoner to his will. Tobirama Senju. Second Hokage of the Leaf. Uncle. He moved the hat on his head before he tossed it to the side completely. He bared his pale skin to the audience, and showed off his long white hair. Welcome. Once again, we stand together in mourning. In mourning for what has been taken from us. Fathers. Mothers. Sons. Daughters. Brothers. Sisters. All gone at the hands of the enemy as they sought to do the impossible. They tried to extinguish the will of fire. Every year, we hold this procession to mourn, and every year I remind you all that they have failed. What they sought to extinguish burns hot and bright. 8 years ago, my nephew, Itama Senju, son of Hashirama, was killed in an ambush from cowardly shinobi of Iwagakure at the twilight of the Great War. Now, I present to you his son, Hashirama Senju. What? What did he mean? I felt my minder push me forward and my legs complied before my brain could stop them. I covered the few steps that separated me from my granduncle on the rooftop of the giant Hokage Tower in what felt like slow motion. My eyes twitched as I looked for some sort of salvation from whatever this was to be. Searching for my mother was a waste of time. She didn't attend. Few things could rouse her from bed, and a memorial in her late husband's honor was not one of them. I met Tsunade's eyes as I walked past her, and for the first time today she was paying full attention. Sharp eyes followed me on every step I took. When I finally reached him, I felt strong hands grab onto my shoulder as I was turned around to look at the crowd. I gulped at the sight. It looked like all of Konoha was here. Thousands of citizens lined the walkways, surrounding the tower and stretching back far and wide. This was the village hidden in the leaves in her full glory. My nephew will continue his education at the Konoha Shinobi Academy in the hopes of living up to his father's legacy. The Hidden Stone thought they would rob us of one of our own with their cowardly attack, but here Itama's son stands, ready to take up his father's mantle in defense of the will of fire. I urge you all. Follow Hashirama's example. Enroll your children and wards in the academy today. After that, I zoned out. My thoughts were flooded. The Shinobi Academy. I'd never been an idiot. I knew that as a descendant of both the Senju and Hyuga clans, I'd be expected to become a shinobi one way or another. But nothing had ever been said about the academy. From what I knew, the academy was for civilian children. Clan children received their tutelage at home. My tutelage had been handled by a rotating contingent of retainers from the Hyuga branch family. Everything from etiquette and calligraphy to taijutsu and shurikenjutsu had been covered in those lessons. They told me of my genius loudly and often. I had no doubts that I was quite ahead of my age group. So why was I being shunted off to the academy? What kind of stunt was that? One thing most people didn't know about Uzumaki Mito was that apart from being a wise old woman, she had one hell of a temper. And the second that she'd gotten wind of what had happened at the Remembrance Festival, she wasted no time in showing up to the Hokage Tower. In fact, she was sitting down on the chair that her husband had once occupied by the time that we'd returned from the festival. After Tobirama's speech came a ton of ceremony. There would be music, and dancing, and various ninjutsu performances. It was still a somber affair, but every year it became just a little bit less so. Just 4 years ago, the thought of music would have been ludicrous. Tobirama was a genius when it came to using progressive overload to make the citizenry get used to adding more and more celebratory tones to the festival. A necessary one, he replied with a sigh, not contesting her presence on his seat. A decision that I was sure was a wise one. Mito was an old woman, but she was still the nine-tailed Jinchuriki for a reason. She had strength aplenty. How? Please tell me how announcing the whereabouts of my grandson to every spy and agent of the other villages can count as necessary? She asked, tone calm but having the subtext of something dark. I looked up at Tsunade, not sure if I should even be here in the first place. I know the risks. We'll have to trust in the Academy security, but the enrollments in the Academy from the civilians still hasn't recovered to the levels from before the war. Every analyst assumed that after a few years, along with all the new benefits being created for families with children in the Academy, that we'd get the numbers back up, but we haven't. I chose to change tacks. The truth is they won't trust the Academy because the clans don't. If they see the son of Hashirama's eldest going to the Academy as well, then that might be enough to get them to consider it, at the very least. It's also going to be good for enrollments from Clan Ninja. The other clans still want to get as close to the Senju as possible. Having Shorarama in the Academy tells them that that's the place to do it. He explained, trying to win Mito over with pure logic. Even with the best of the best watching over him, Hashirama had to deal with assassination attempts every other week. That was how much the others feared him. Even Tsunade, his Jounin granddaughter, has had to deal with much the same over the years. Now you want to present them the target of my other grandchild? No, Toby. No. I refuse. She said, the edge in her tone was now unmistakable. You don't really get a choice in this, the second Hokage, well-known negotiator, said next. Even I could see it was a blunder. It didn't take a second for the chakra in the room to begin to choke the air out of my lungs. Nope, I heard from beside me, and the next thing I knew I was back on the rooftop safe in Tsunade's arms. Shorarama-sama, do it like this instead, the Hyuga branch member said, directing me through the forms of the advanced gentle fist kata once again. I made my best attempt at copying his movements, but even I could tell that I wasn't getting it quite right. Is everything alright, Shorarama-sama? You usually pick things up faster than this, he asked, making me want to snap at him. In fact, when I opened my mouth after whirling to face him, I could see that he expected me to snap. He cringed backwards a little, and that little movement was enough to make me snap out of it. I just have a lot on my mind. Why am I even learning this in the first place? It's not like I'm ever going to get the Byakugan, I said to him, running my hands over my black hair. I thank the gods that I hadn't inherited the rough hair of the Senju. Hyuga hair was much easier to manage. Looked better too. We've covered this before, Shorarama-sama. Even without the Byakugan, the gentle fist can still be utilized as the basis for a devastating taijutsu style. Even beyond this, while the inability to see individual tenketsu means that you'll never get to use the gentle fist to its full potential, a liver shot is still a liver shot. And with chakra added to your strikes, you'll cause as much damage as any gentle fist user. Besides, you've only been practicing for 5 years now and you're already working through the advanced forms. Not letting a genius like you work with the gentle fist would be a travesty, he said to me, combining legitimate feedback with some good old arse kissing. I nodded at him, scowl still on my face, and returned to the session. From the corner of my eyes, I could see Grandmother Mito watching me from the balcony. Even though Mother was the sister to the Hyuga clashed, I was still the grandson of Hashirama. There was only one place where I could be expected to grow up. The Senju clan compound. Sure, the Hyuga sent dozens of their household staff to ensure Mother lived in the luxury she'd grown up used to, and probably to make sure they had some influence on my upbringing, but don't say that one too loudly. When I failed my next attempt, I heard clapping from the balcony. I turned again, and noticed that Tsunade had joined Grandmother on the balcony, and now was being scolded for her mockery. The smile that spread across my face at Tsunade's abashed expression was bittersweet. I turned back to my instructor, his Byakugan focused on me as I went through the forms once again. My head still wasn't in it, but I managed to make sure that I didn't make any mistakes as I went through the forms. Well done, Shorarama-sama. Now a few more tries and it will be perfect, he said with a smile on his face. Hate was a man who smiled easily and acted like a puppy in the body of a man. He was skilled, easily on the level of a jounin, but his easygoing nature and timid personality meant that he got to spend his days training brats like me instead of writing his name in the history books with the blood of Konoha's enemies. He got a good deal. Not a deal that I'd ever get, however. I had _expectations_. Alright. That's enough for today. I'll take over my grandson's training for today, I heard from above as Grandmother Mito began descending the stairs. She did it slowly for the first few steps before turning to my cousin and barking, "Come help your grandmother, you fool girl." Tsunade wasted no time in catching up to her and helping her down the stairs. But Mito-sama Tobirama-sama agreed with the elders to hate was cut off almost as quickly as he began. "I don't care what my brother-in-law has agreed with your clan. This is my grandson," she said firmly. Any other member of the Hyuga clan would have stood their ground. Not hate. The man bowed and disappeared with a shunshin almost immediately. I had no doubts that he was going to report to whatever elders he answered to. "Now that it's just family here, what do you say we do something fun?" she asked me, and my smile could have blinded the sun. There was one thing that lessons with Mito meant. Sure, she'd been a skilled enough shinobi in her time, but what made her truly special was her prowess with Fuinjutsu. That was what she spent her time trying to pass down to me. "Come along with us, Tsunade," she said, dragging my cousin with us once she noticed her attempt to disappear in a shunshin of her own. "Fuinjutsu is so boring," Tsunade drawled as Mito began to physically drag her with us towards the practice room, her act of being a frail old woman long abandoned. "Yay, Fuinjutsu," I said, pumping one hand in the air. Pretending to be an 8-year-old could be fun, sometimes. Especially for annoying foolish cousins. "What distinguishes a seal in Fuinjutsu from a hand seal used in ninjutsu?" she asked the both of us as we sat in seiza before her, scrolls out and brushes at out left-hand sides. That was an interesting trait we shared, Tsunade and I, left-handedness. I racked my brain for an answer, while it looked to all the world that Tsunade had mentally checked out from the lesson. I knew that in canon, Tsunade would become competent with Fuinjutsu, competent enough to have a seal on her literal forehead, but the fact that even then she'd be considered lesser to both her teammates said a lot. With a pedigree like hers, no one should have been able to come close. She just wasn't interested. A direct opposite to me, at the very least. I had a passion for Fuinjutsu. Partly because of how easy it came to a brain that had aced university-level physics, and also partly because of how necessary it would be. Fuinjutsu was one hell of an equalizer, and it was one of the few things that could bridge the gap between Jounin and the literal natural disasters in human skin known as S-rank ninja. It was my theory that only the Flying Thunder God could have made Minato a monster capable of running circles around 2 or even 3 S-rank shinobi at the same time. Sure, he never managed to actually kill them, but surviving to tell the tale was a feat on its own. Needless to say, I had a shit ton of motivation fueling my interest. Fuinjutsu seals are written, but hand seals are done with the hands, I finally said after racking my brain trying to come up with something at least more inspired. Tsunade's instant chuckle at my response was not the most encouraging thing, but I'd long since learned not to expect encouragement from this version of the Sannin. She was firmly in her troublesome teens and had somehow decided that being a sarcastic bitch to everyone who shared blood with her was the ideal way to assert her independence and maturity. Never mind that she still lived in the clan compound and spent clan money on whatever whims caught her fancy. Sure, she donated her entire pay to the clan, but that was besides the point. Something slightly more than the readily apparent, Shori-chan Mito deadpanned, making me flush entirely against my will. That was a good one. Fuinjutsu seals are more varied. There's as many as 369 characters in the Uzumaki script alone, and it's just one of dozens, but there are only 12 hand signs. 12 standard ones, at least, Tsunade suddenly said, making me turn to her. The way she rolled her eyes at me once she noticed my attention made me want to curse out loud, but I just took the loss. It stung to lose to someone who wasn't even trying, but that was the way the world worked. Slightly better, and close to the actual answer. But wrong still, Mito said, making me want to jump up and celebrate. Tsunade's smug look was wiped off her face quicker than grime in the face of a pressure hose. An accurate answer lies in their purpose. Hand seals regulate the flow of chakra in the body. They act as a crutch for ninjutsu or genjutsu, telling your chakra to contort itself in a predetermined manner. That is why when you get skilled enough, you can shave a few seals off a jutsu or even abandon the use of seals in their entirety. As she spoke, as if to demonstrate her point, the world around us began to shift as she seamlessly placed us both under genjutsu while her hands were on the table for us both to see. First of all, my view of the scene became monochrome before the world started to shift as color swam into my vision from the edges in a chaotic mess. I looked to my right, only this time I wasn't able to see Tsunade anymore. Suddenly, everything crashed around me as I felt myself return to reality. While Fuinjutsu does something else. It couldn't care less about how chakra flows within your body, although there are quite a few seals that can help with that. Instead, Fuinjutsu seals tell reality itself how to behave. Fuinjutsu allows you to impose your will on the universe. To master Fuinjutsu is the closest humanity can come to visiting the realm of the gods. That is why you can never remove seals from a matrix without finding a way to compensate for it. Reality is a dense, unyielding thing. And to even bend it, you have to play by its rules. That is what separates the seals we Uzumaki use from the seals that the rest of the world is familiar with, she said, staring at the both of us, trying to convey the importance of her words with her stare alone. I thought I understood it then. I'd find out in time that Mito's words were the tip of it. Why do I have angry Hyuga elders bombarding my secretary with requests to meet? We heard a voice from behind us. A familiar voice. I whirled around TP, come faced with the familiar white robes that Uncle wore on a daily basis. The robes that marked him as the Hokage. Well, not just the robes. The robes and feet adorned with shinobi sandals. I looked up to his face to see him looking down at the three of us with a raised eyebrow. Neither Tsunade nor Mito looked shocked to see him. Of course, they'd sensed him coming. I wanted to have a lesson with my grandson. Surely, your politicking cannot rob me of that, grandmother said with a snarky voice. I could already tell that she wasn't in a good mood for the interruption. You were privy to every aspect of the negotiations, Mito. You know that we had to make compromises for us to even get to raise him here. The marriage agreement Itama signed was very specific, and getting out of it was a feat in and of itself. I don't care. He is my grandson. I wanted time with him, and I got it. You're the one sending him to your foolish pet project and reducing the time he spends at home in the first place, she said, pointing right at him in an accusing tone. I already explained my reasons for having him join the academy. It worked even. We'd got as many as thrice the number of applicants in this year's batch, he said, looking very proud of himself as he reached up to adjust his hat. Still, his time at home is reducing and I wanted time to teach him valuable skills. The Hyuga were teaching him some useless kata among a dozen that no one would even get to use in a real battle, she said, not having the best opinion of Hyuga taijutsu. Mito didn't have the best opinion on many Hyuga things. If I didn't share their appearances so thoroughly, I was sure she'd have had a few choice words to say about their looks as well. I will speak with the elders. We will renegotiate Shorarama's schedule to make room for your lessons with the inclusion of the academy. And free time for him to play as well, Tsunade added, tossing in her 2 cents. There aren't enough hours in a day for such frivolity. Don't be ridiculous, he denied without even giving his grandniece a look. If that is settled then, I have Shorarama now. He's the right age for him to start with the trials, uncle said before reaching down and grabbing my shoulder. I didn't hear Mito reply before I found myself in a completely different location. Looking around told me we were on the cliff face that would become the Hokage Rock in time. It overlooked the rest of the village, and the view was truly breathtaking. Do you know why I brought you here, Shorarama? He asked, joining me at the edge of the cliff, looking over the village. No. You said something about trials, I replied. Well, trials might be the wrong word to use here. Are you aware of the clan traditions? He asked. No, I replied simply. That was the truth. I knew so much about the Uzumaki and Hyuga clans, but when you compared that knowledge with what I had about the Senju, it was pitifully lacking. Yes. I am to blame for that. As the eldest male in your family, it is my duty to teach you about the clan history and traditions, but duty has kept me away from much of your childhood, he said, sounding slightly apologetic. That was enough to make me look up in surprise. I'd known Tobarama for all of my new life, and if there was one thing he never did, it was apologize. He and Mito had had so many fights about it. Well, this is one tradition that we can't really negotiate, he said, turning away from the village to look at me. I mirrored his movements and looked up to meet his eyes. Our clan name. Senju. 1,000 skills or 1,000 hands, depending on how you see it. It comes from the fact that even back in the Warring States period, no 2 Senju shinobi were the same. We had such a wide range of skills and focuses. Just look at my brother and I. We were both trained by our father, Butsuma, and the arms master, Kentetsu, but our fighting styles could not be more varied, he said, launching into an exposition that I found difficult to relate with our previous conversation. I know, granduncle, I said in reply. All these were things I knew already. I might not have had fixed lessons on Senju clan history, but even the most proud Hyuga wouldn't dare lecture me about my proud ancestry without even glossing over the most famous men on either side of my bloodline. Hashirama and Tobarama. One who ended the Warring States period, almost single-handedly, and another who led Konoha through the largest war that the world has ever had the displeasure of witnessing. What you don't know is why. Each one of us is unique. It is a feature of our clan. Everything, from our affinities to talents, tend to be varied. That means that unlike the Uchiha who have a single test for determining when one becomes an adult, We wouldn't dare put something so limiting. They have the great fireball jutsu as their test. This is ours, he said, turning to me and beginning to weave seals. I watched him with sharp eyes, cataloging and forcing everything to memory. My lessons had included a lot of the things I needed to be a successful shinobi. One of them was the ability to memorize things with only one look. Not everything, but a string of hand seals was easy enough for even me. Tiger then ox, tiger again, and ending in the rat seal. Tobirama smiled at my attention on him. I must have salivated as I focused on him. The Hyuga clan weren't known for their ninjutsu prowess, and with the earliest parts of my education being entirely in their control, it was no surprise that this was the first true piece of ninjutsu I would ever be learning. Water release. Water bullet, Tobirama said, and spat out a condensed stream of water that shot through one of the trees in front of us and continued to go forwards, covering the distance at an impressive speed before it dissolved. He smiled at me before he started going through more seals. More than one jutsu? Boar, ram, snake, horse, dragon. His hands moved through just as languidly as the first time, and this time he stretched out both hands at the end of the string of seals. Lightning release. Electromagnetic murder, he said as his hands flashed white and multiple streams of electricity shot out of said hands before slamming into a conveniently placed boulder that they shattered into nothing more than a collection of loose stone. Still, Tobirama did not stop. He formed only a single seal this time. The bird seal. Wind release. Air bullets, he said before inhaling and breathing out a condensed series of breaths. The jutsu was invisible to the naked eyes, but I noticed its effect when it landed, tearing through several trees and leaving small circular holes behind. More seals began as Tobirama turned away from the forest to the cliff face. This time, they were seals I was more than familiar with after seeing them so many times in the anime. Snake, ram, monkey, boar, horse, tiger, he used, holding the tiger seal in front of his mouth as he inhaled an impressive amount of air before breathing out what could only be described as a firestorm. It was loosely contained in the shape of a ball of fire as it streaked across the village sky. I wondered then why he had chosen this spot of all others to show me ninja techniques. It was also curious that of all jutsu to overpower so heavily, it just happened to be this one. Fire release. Great fireball jutsu, he said as we watched the ball fly over the village before it began to dissipate as Tobirama cut off the stream of chakra and it found nothing to latch onto. And now the last one. He said to me before he began to flip through the next series of seals, tiger, hare, boar, dog, or ram, dog, ox, snake. My suspicion that it would be an earth release jutsu were proven accurate when he bent and slapped his hands on the ground before saying out loud, earth release. Earth wall. A massive wall of pure stone rose from the ground in front of us in seconds. As I beheld ninja magic in person. This was just something else. One powerful jutsu from every element? That's the test? I asked, looking at him in shock. That's the test for the clan head's bloodline, he specified, giving me a significant look. So this wasn't what the rest of the clan had to go through. It was for us and us alone. Tsunade passed this? I asked him, shocked. She never seemed like a ninjutsu specialist to me. Here, Tobirama scoffed in reply. Barely. Your cousin was content to display the barest competence with each of the techniques. Enough to pass, but definitely not what I will be expecting from you, he said to me. Of course. No pressure at all. He seemed to realize the impact his words could have as he turned towards me and bent down on his knees. You, Hashirama, are the product of two of Konoha's strongest clans. Two of the strongest clans in the entire world. The Hyuga enjoy a long history that goes back just as far as ours, and you are the product of the best of both those bloodlines. Grandson of Hashirama, the greatest Senju to ever live, and great-grandson of Hayashi, greatest Hyuga to ever live. You have so much potential in you. Potential to be greater than every single one of us who came before you. No pressure, indeed. 12 years before the second great shinobi wore Uchiha Yuzum. She resisted the urge to look behind her again to catch a glimpse of him. Long black hair that reached his shoulders and a warm smile that made it look like he had no worries in the world. She already hated him. He was the reason she was here. The youngest of the Uchiha clan head's 4 children, and the only one that would be expected to waste her time attending an academy to be taught by people unworthy to even clean her father's boots. She'd be the first Uchiha from the main family to enroll in this shinobi academy, and it was that bastard's fault. She heard his laughter come from behind her. Loud and easy as he entertained a group of civilians, asking about their lives and telling jokes. The joke hadn't even been funny, she thought to herself as the civilian-born joined him in his loud laughter. She'd expected to be the first one here after arriving almost 30 minutes early, all so she could secure a seat at the back where she wouldn't be disturbed. Shockingly, she'd come in and found the classroom filled to the brim already. Most of them already knew each other, talking and trading information with ease. The opening ceremony, she suspected. She'd missed the event a day earlier, wanting to deny the reality for as long as she could. So what did you do next? She heard him ask the Inuzuka from across the room, intruding into the conversation the dog boy had been having with the Nara girl next to him. She expected the Inuzuka to put him in his place, tell him to butt off and mind his business. Of course, her expectations weren't met. The Inuzuka turned back with a wide smile on his face and began projecting his voice to tell the story of him sneaking into the kennels and meeting his companion to the whole class. So Haimaru, Mom's Nankin, was sleeping but his mate wasn't. And she was pissed to see me. She tuned him out and began to go through her memories to find something to occupy her. She absently noted that she would have to come along with a scroll or something to read tomorrow. She thought of all the things she could have been doing with her time instead of this. She could be working on her great fireball jutsu. Father said she was coming along faster than any of her brothers had managed to. She could be the youngest to perfect the jutsu since Madara himself if things went well enough. At least, that was what she thought. Having to spend half her day here would be one hell of a time drain. Almost like the universe was taking pity on her and deciding to be merciful, she heard a sudden ringing from the outside. A bell? With that cue, a man body flickered into the room. The light green vest around his upper body marked him as a chunin. Good morning, he said to the shocked class, only getting replied by the Senju boy who practically sang his reply. Bastard. Welcome to the Ninja Academy. I am Uraraka Kichizun, chunin of Kanahigakure. You will refer to me as Uraraka-sensei, he said. She felt a hand on her shoulder and almost jolted if she didn't hear his voice immediately after. Want to go out for lunch with us, Uchiha-san? I have extra, he said, looking down on her with those black eyes of his. He looked like a puppy. Like the one the Inuzuka boy had on top his head right now. No. Stay away from me, she said, swiping his hand off her shoulder with a negligent flick of her own. Part of her delighted in the way his smile died. But it was a temporary feeling, as by the time he looked back up, the smile was back and as bright as ever. Let's go, guys, he said to the rest of the class as they followed him down. Not the whole class, it turned out, as she looked up to see someone standing in front of her desk. What are you doing? He asked her, staring down at her with eyes that she knew mirrored hers. No one in their generation had inherited the Uchiha looks as strongly as the both of them had. What does it look like? Sitting down to eat lunch, cousin, she said, looking at him like he was stupid. Sometimes, Izuku was actually stupid. Why were you so rude to Senju-san? Your father sent us here to make friends and allies, not alienate the entire class, and one day she scowled at the reminder. We're not here to make friends with the Senju, though. Father couldn't care less about the Senju. He sent us here to befriend the other clans. Remind them that we were just as involved in Konoha's founding as the damned Senju. And do you think being rude to the Senju, the one they all see as their friend, would make that any easier? Get out, she snapped finally, turning to her lunch and resolving to ignore him completely. She heard his footsteps as he made to leave the classroom, leaving her behind. She hated it here, she decided finally. She hated the damn Senju, and the Inuzuka, and all of them, and Uraraka-sensei, and even stupid Izuku. How was the academy? He asked as she wasted no time in barreling towards him like a rocket. She didn't bother noticing the rest of her classmates being picked up by parents or siblings, or even Senju being escorted away by a servant. She didn't care about the rest of them. She had her brother here with her. Terrible, Tenjin. I hate it there, she said, wasting no time and beginning to make her case for never returning. Really? Why? It's just the first day, he said, sounding taken aback. They don't like me. None of them. Senju has them all wrapped around his fingers. And that's why you want to leave? Are you saying it's not a good reason? I'll let you discuss that with father. Instead, how do you feel about going to get some dango and then kunai shopping? I think we can get you your own set since you'll need one at the academy. Her bad mood wiped away instantly, like clouds chased away by the sun, as her brother reached down to pick her up and then plop her on his shoulders. She laughed as they began to cover the distance to the dango shop in a leisurely walk that made the wind blow across her hair. She almost slammed her head against the table at hearing that particular voice as they walked into the weapons shop. That bow, uncle, she heard him say right as they entered. They didn't turn around to look at them as she walked in with her brother, but she could make out that cloak and hair anywhere. It was the second Hokage, and with him her hated nemesis, Senju Shorarama. They were both looking at a highly ostentatious bow. Beautiful, but much too showy for her tastes. Of course it would be the kind of thing Senju would like. It was made of gleaming wood. Rarer than the wood on any of the hundreds of trees within the village, definitely. Like every other bow, it was a curved piece of wood with a string tied to either side. The wood was a deep black. If Hachiman was here, he'd identify the species of tree that gave the wood, and even its age and when the wood was harvested with just a single look. Made of ebony, young Senju-sama. It is a good choice, the store attendant said, and she resisted the urge to roll her eyes at the obvious sales tactic. Surprisingly, Senju didn't appear to be fooled by that. It is beautiful, I agree. But perhaps something simpler would be a better choice for the time being. You are to be a shinobi, after all, the Hokage said, addressing his grandnephew. To Yuzume's surprise, the undoubtedly spoiled brat actually listened to the Hokage's wisdom, and they moved on to search for a different bow. She wondered what they were even looking at bows for. He wasn't going to be a samurai. He was going to be a shinobi. Shinobi don't use bows, she said to herself. Everyone knew that. Even the weakest of her genin cousins could throw a kunai faster than the most skilled samurai could shoot an arrow. They could probably throw it with more force than the arrow, she added. Let's go get your kunai, her brother said to her, pulling on her hand to take her deeper into the shop. The last thing she heard from the Senju duo was, I'm an adult now, you know? From the younger one, as his uncle began making other suggestions than a bow of all things. Nara Shikaheim. How troublesome, she whispered to herself as she entered the classroom to find the Senju boy sitting tight next to the only empty seat in the classroom. The fact that none of the civilians had claimed it made it clear that it was being reserved for someone else. The fact that she was the only one yet to take a seat made it clear that she was the one the seat was being reserved for. She almost turned back to head home. She could already tell that this would end up being a lot more trouble than it was worth. The Senju boy was much too popular for her to spend a day next to and have any hope of a quiet one. Take a seat, Nara-san, Uraraka-sensei said as he walked in from behind her. There was no way the man would let her just decide to turn around and go home. She, with great reluctance, took step after step, counting them to be 7 just as her mother taught her until she was at her seat and had managed to ignore all the eyes on her. She sat down and waited for the man to begin. It's been a month since the first class. Just like I promised you then, today we will have the placement test to divide you into your specific classes, the man said, and suddenly a piece of paper revealed itself on her table. Genjutsu, she surmised. Looking across, the class showed the only one to have been unsurprised by the genjutsu to be the angry Uchiha princess. Indeed, instead of focusing on the test on her table, she was looking their way and muttering in irritation. Whatever the Senju had done to set her off today, Shikaheim knew she wanted no part of. She stared at the test sheet in front of her. Most of the questions were relatively easy to answer for someone like her who had grown up with shinobi all her life and been trained to be one from before she could watch. In fact, the only ones having any true difficulty with the test were the civilians. Among the clan children, she could see only the Inuzuka having any real trouble with his answers, and even then he still had half his sheet filled in the first 10 minutes. As for her, she couldn't deny the temptation to fail the test. Mother would be disappointed, but father would understand. Being in the same class with so many hotshots was bound to be nothing but trouble. 2 Uchiha, 1 Hyuga, the Senju prince, and members from basically every clan that made up the village. If there was one class that would have all the attention and thus trouble thrust at it from the get-go, it would be that one. Father would do the same in her place. But mother would look at her with those eyes. She was sent here to get close to her cousin. To preserve family relations, mother had said. Code for make sure that the Senju don't forget who exactly her mother was and that the Nara were now tied to them by blood. She chanced to look at the little prince from the corner of her eyes to find him with an easy smile on his face, doodling in the corner of his paper. Whenever a civilian tossed a look at him, he would grant them an encouraging smile, almost saying to them, "You can do it." One would never have guessed at his Hyuga heritage with just how much emotion he managed to show with those brown eyes of him. Said eyes met hers, and she instinctively broke the look and returned to her paper. Mother being cross at her would be even more troublesome. The woman was just the sort to show up at the academy and demand they let Shikaheim retake the test. No, troublesome classmates were much preferable at the end of the day. She wouldn't be sleeping in the same building as them. She knocked the questions down one after another, only writing enough to show that she understood what she was being asked. She'd leave overachievement for the Uchiha princess, who seemed keen on answering every question with as much detail as possible. Instead, she followed her cousin's approach. She wrote down the answers quickly, and after drying the ink with a quick flex of her chakra, she flipped it around and tried to zone out into her thoughts like she'd always been able to. From memory, she began to recite the tale of the first shadow to herself, her many times ancestor, Nara Shikamaru. Alright, that's time up, from Uraraka-sensei jolted her from her thoughts. She allowed him collect her test sheet even as she noted several civilian children begin to rush to fill in undoubtedly wrong answers on the empty spots on their sheet. The man was unflinching as he grabbed each and every sheet in order as he walked through the class. Whatever tears or begging he received went ignored in his flat expression. Dull black eyes simply staring down those who dared resist. When he got to her, he tossed her a smile as he turned her sheet over before giving her cousin a long flat look as he caught a glimpse of the back of his test sheet. Shikaheim looked over to see what the Chunin was looking at and almost tripped on her chair as she suddenly stood up. The rest of the classroom turned to her, before their eyes turned to the Senju boy. "Is this supposed to be funny?" Uraraka-sensei demanded, and her cousin just shrugged with a smile. She almost cursed herself as she got a better look at the sheet as her sensei thrust it at her cousin. He hadn't been doodling on the back of his sheet like she'd thought. No, the troublesome piece of work had drawn a full-blown explosive seal on the back of his test sheet. She'd seen enough of such seals in the clan armories to be able to tell them apart from any other. The Uchiha princess looked similarly astounded as she got a look at the seal, while the rest of the class were left to wallow in confusion. Detention. "Trust me, your guardians will be hearing of this," he said, making her cousin's smile die out a little bit. "Nara-san, return to your seat. The seal is inactive." "It's a dud," her sensei said to her, turning to pin her with a reassuring look. Not a look that she'd have expected after the anger that had been on his face nary a second ago, but she took the assurance for what it was and returned to her seat. If she moved it along the floor a little bit to gain some distance from her clearly insane relative, then no one could judge her. "We'll be heading outside for the physical tests now," Uraraka-sensei said, prompting a whoop from the Inuzuka boy in front. Inukuro, she remembered from the introductions. The academy's training grounds were a wide open field most of the time. Today was different. Someone had gone to the trouble of setting up a complex obstacle course. She could already make out a climbing wall, swinging logs that had to be avoided, a tightrope that had to be run across, and some swinging rings that one had to jump across, along with a dozen other tasks on the course. Troublesome. She silently judged it to be. If the first test had been easy, then this one would be anything but. So how would you get past that tightrope? She heard one of the civilian boys, Takahata Toshiro, ask their resident Senju prince as they stared at the course. "The safest way is to turn around and climb across it with one's hands and knees. It would be faster to just run across it," however her cousin said, unknowingly echoing her inner thoughts on the matter. She'd probably be able to run across it with ease. It went without saying that each of the clan children had begun training to become shinobi long before being enrolled at the academy. In fact, she was willing to bet that the reason most of them were here was the boy behind her. The grandson of Hashirama, the first Hokage, and the grandnephew of Tobarama the second. In line to take over as clan head after his granduncle. "So who wants to go first?" their sensei asked, only for no one to step forward after a second. In the next second, both the Senju and Uchiha children had stepped forwards. "Senju Shorarama. You will go first," he said, making the angry Uchiha princess stare daggers into the man. If the rumors were to be believed, then their sensei would have fallen dead a dozen times over. Shikaheim figured that if the Uchiha could indeed kill by staring with those eyes of theirs, then this one hadn't learned that technique yet. "Hyuga Uram." She walked into the classroom, momentarily stopping in her tracks. There, right in the middle, 2 seats from the front, and 2 from the back, sat her cousin, Senju Shorarama. "It's 6 a.m., she told herself as she watched him notice her, and then erupt into a smile before waving at her. How could he have arrived this early? It didn't even make sense. She'd decided to leave home at a ridiculously early hour so she could beat him to the academy for the first time, and now he was already here. "How are you doing, cousin?" "Good morning," he said to her, smile bright and hands spread out in a wave. "Well met, cousin. I do hope I have a good morning." "I wish you the same," she said in reply before walking in and taking her seat one away from him. Last time she'd sat at his right-hand side, but since he'd gotten bored and made an explosive tag in class yesterday, Father had been very clear that she should keep a cautious distance. "So far away, cousin," he said, calling attention to her choice of seat. "No offense is intended, cousin. I woke up feeling bilious and with a raging headache. I felt it would be better if I sat next to the window," she said, lying with ease. Her cousin smiled at her, believing her words with no hesitation. It made her wonder, just like she had been doing for the weeks they'd spent in the academy, whether he was worth all the attention he received. Even before enrolling, she made sure to be constantly informed of the progress he made. According to Kabuki, he was skilled with the gentle fist, but still quite a bit behind her when it came to expertise. He knew more kata than she did, but when it came to sparring, he was apparently leagues behind her. That fact alone made her wonder if he'd turn out worth it. Father thought he could be Hokage one day, and quite frankly she could not see it. He was intelligent, to be certain. Physically skilled, as well. The only ones who could compare with his when it came to physical tests were the 2 Uchiha, herself, and the Inuzuka boy. The rest of the class were well behind them, with the clan children closer than those of civilian breeding. Her cousin had returned to reading from his scroll, so she settled to wait as their classmates began to trickle in. She noticed how, like yesterday, he went to the trouble of ensuring that no one sat at the seat to his left. Saving it for the Nara girl again? She'd asked Father why, and his best guess had been the blood relation that he shared with her. Her mother had been his grandfather's cousin, after all. That made them cousins, but not as close as she had with him. His mother was her aunt. That made her his closest relative close to his age. When the class filled up, and even the Nara girl had entered, their sensei appeared in front of them with a body flicker. She subtly activated her Byakugan to make sure there wasn't another genjutsu ensnaring their perception. The fact that she'd fallen for the first genjutsu yesterday had grated at her more than she would have been willing to admit. With her Dijutsu active, she noted the 2 other Chunin behind the door. There are 37 of you in this class now. We will be dividing you into classes of 3, with each class having roughly 12 students apiece. If you hear your name, you should please follow Jinpachi-sensei as he leads you to your new classroom, he said as one of the men behind the door walked in. His brown hair and brown eyes marked him to be what she'd heard her cousin impolitely refer to as an NPC. For some reason, he viewed having a regular appearance as the first sign that a person would not be destined for greatness. It was ridiculous, but had a strange logic to it. Uraraka-sensei went on to list out 12 civilian children who followed their new sensei out of the classroom with a mixture of confusion and excitement. They didn't realize what was happening. When the next set of names were read out to follow the next teacher, she noted that this time they appeared more despondent. These ones were smart enough to realize that if they were being separated into classes the day after taking a test, then it had to be based on that test. The fact that not a single clan ninja had been called with their group should have made it obvious that they weren't in the premier group. I'm sure you've figured it out now, he said as they remained 12 children in the classroom. We've been split up according to ability, the sole civilian in the classroom pointed out. Yes, you have. This is Class 1A. You all performed the best in the assessment tests. But don't let that get to your heads. Your place here is not set in stone. Every 3 months, you will take assessment tests along with the other classes. Only the top 12 will remain here. If you ever fall below that, then you'd be reassigned to one of the other classes, depending on where you fall along the rankings, he said, making the half of the class that had begun to whisper among themselves sit up suddenly. Just so you know where you fall in this class rankings and how close you were to being on one of the other classes, here are the rankings. 1. Uchiha Yuzum. 2. Senju Shoirama. 3. Uchiha Izuku. 4. Hyuga Urom. 5. Kurama Kizuru. 6. Aburame Shiba. 7. Nara Shikeheim. 8. Takahata Toshiro. 9. Sarutobi Omoikane. 10. Yamanaka Inoken. 11. Akimichi Choni. 12. Inazuka Inukuro. As each person heard their name, they proceeded to straighten up in their seats. She was unsurprised to have ranked below her cousin and the 2 Uchiha. They'd all made short work of the obstacle course in a way that she had not. The gentle fist did not require much in the way of flexibility, and so her tutelage had lacked that. The Uchiha's intercepting fist had a high flexibility focus, her studies had told her, and Kabuki had revealed that her cousin spent a significant portion of his time stretching and had taken up dancing of all things. For the rest, the list fell just as she'd expected it to. The fact that the Inazuka boy had performed better than her at the obstacle course and still somehow ranked last probably meant that he basically failed the written portion of the test. She could understand that. The test had been more difficult than she'd expected. It even covered some things that she'd yet to learn in her own studies. Another surprising fact was the presence of the civilian. He performed worse than everyone in the room at the physical tests. He'd even performed worse than some of the civilians that had been sent of the room to one of the lowest classes. The only way he managed to rank so highly would be if he'd gotten an essentially perfect score on the written test. That was impressive. Now that you know where you stand, our first lesson will be on chakra natures, her sensei said as he turned to the board and wrote down the day's topic. First of all, what is chakra? He asked, and half the class rose their hands. Not her cousin, he never volunteered his knowledge like that. Nara-san, the sensei said, pointing at one of the few people without a hand raised. The girl looked like she'd been about to fall asleep. Urom resisted the urge to sniff haughtily only by the tightest of margins as a result of the most precise application of will. Chakra is the combination of physical and spiritual energy, she said simply before returning her head to its position on her palm. Uraraka-sensei was pleased with the answer and moved on. Perfect. That is a textbook definition. Chakra can only be utilized in one of 2 ways. What are they? He asked, turning to the class again. This time, Urom was one of only 4 people with their hands up. This time, the sensei pointed out someone with a raised hand. Takahata-san, enlighten us. Shape transformation and nature transformation. Shape transformation works by using control of one's chakra to force raw chakra to take a shape outside of one's body. It is usually used in conjunction with nature transformation, as there is no known jutsu that consists of pure shape manipulation. Nature transformation works by transforming raw chakra within one's body into one of the 5 primary elements, or a composite element, made from a combination of any of those 5 elements, as seen in Kekkei Genkai, he said, and she wondered where a civilian could have come across such information in such detail. Lovely answer, Takahata-san. He's wrong, her cousin cut in, making the class turn to him. Is he? Tell us why then, Senju-san, their sensei said, turning to him with sharp eyes. There aren't 5 chakra natures. There are 7, he said, sending Yurom reeling as she counted them off in her head: fire, water, earth, lightning, and wind, she mentally recited, running through them in order. 7? Tell us more. Fire, water, earth, lightning, wind, yin and yang, he said. Yin and yang? What were those? You are correct, Senju-san. But both yin and yang release are beyond the scope of the curriculum, so we'll be operating under the fiction that there are only 5. He said, confusing the class further. Uchiha Izuku. He funneled his chakra into the slip of paper, as he'd been taught to by his uncle. The chakra paper, expectedly, crinkled at the edges before bursting into flames. He'd only paid it half his attention. Like he was sure about his cousin, he'd taken this test before. Most of his attention, therefore, was on the other members of the classroom. Sarutobi Omoikane and his cousin both had their slips erupt in flames in showy manners, to the shock of absolutely no one. The Nara girl having an earth affinity was interesting. Izuku could only imagine how dangerous the clan's shadow manipulation would be with the ability to use earth release to create, or extend shadows at her whim. Only if she learned elemental ninjutsu, however. The clan was famous for their laziness in that respect. Senju Shorarama's slip was perhaps the one that had the most attention directed at it. Would he favor water release like his granduncle? Maybe even water and earth like his grandfather? Lightning like his father? The one that was said to have been so skilled that it had taken the Reikage himself to kill him. Or even fire? Fire would not be unprecedented. This was the land of fire at the end of the day, and while the Senju clan tended to have diverse affinities, fire was still the most popular in their ranks. The Senju seemed to know that his slip was what everyone waited for, and he took an agonizing amount of time in funneling his chakra into the paper. It was almost like he was trying to punish them for paying so much attention. Izuku found that unlikely on its own. If there was one thing Shorarama liked and excelled with, it was being the center of attention. Maybe this was his attempt to give them a show and hold on to the attention by dragging things out as much as he could. Finally, chakra went into the slip of paper and it began by splitting in half before soaking through and then dissolving into dirt. Wind, water, and earth? 3 affinities? That was nearly unheard of. Even having 2 like Izuku did was noteworthy, but 3 was just something else. The entire class was staring at him, and he just smiled at them all. Now that everyone's affinities are known, we will begin covering the theory around elemental training. Uraraka-sensei's words drew all the attention to him. 10 years before the Second Great Shinobi World War, Nara Shikaheim. Troublesome, she thought to herself as she walked into the classroom and found the seat that she'd been forced to occupy for the past 2 years filled by someone else. She almost tripped over her feet in surprise when she entered and found the Kurama boy sitting next to her Senju cousin. She'd expected the boy to get bored of her eventually, but the fact that it had taken him 2 years to do so was just something else. By his right sat Uchiha Izuku, the only polite member of the family in her generation. She wasted no time in taking her seat blissfully far away from the spotlight that followed the Senju on every waking hour. She heard a sound from their place in the center of the classroom, and enjoyed observing from a distance the melodious tones the Kurama boy produced with the flute he held in his hands. It was a beautiful thing, made of pale wood that was so white it looked to be ivory from certain angles. The holes were perfectly circular, just as the mouth opening was made perfectly suited for the boy's mouth. It was the work of a master craftsman, and the sheer cost of it would probably have bankrupted many a family. A lovely gift, Senju-san. Shorarama, please, Kizuru. I've told you a dozen times, call me by my name. Well, that answered one question. The gift had come from the Senju boy. Of course, he had Hyuga blood on one side and Senju on the other. She doubted anyone would ever have access to the kind of wealth he did. The bulk of the village was built on Senju land, after all. Play me something else, please, he said after the Kurama boy said something to him. A melodic tune began to spread across the classroom. A haunting tone that both said everything and nothing at the same time. Shikaheim would hesitate to call herself an expert in music. No, Nara really could. But she did know what good music sounded like. She'd attended enough festivals and celebrations to make it clear to her what a master of their craft could produce. What she heard Kurama Kizuru produce was not at all far away from what those people could create. It made her wonder when he'd begun practicing the instrument. It also made her wonder just how the Senju boy had been able to find out about it in time to procure such a gift for the other boy's birthday. It didn't matter though. Spending her time basking in the privacy of not being the center of attention should have been enough for her. She leaned backwards and hoped to drift off into sleep. She should have had 20 minutes until their sensei showed up. Of course, the universe decided to put all her expectations to shame. Her desk exploded in sound as someone slammed a hand down on it. She opened her eyes and came face to face with orbs of smoldering coal that looked like they were permanently alight with fire. Uchiha Yuzum. Her black hair fell down her face in ringlets that framed high cheekbones in perfect lighting. "You're on my seat, Nara," she snarled, and it took Shikaheim a second to parse the words and realize that the rude girl was indeed right. Somehow in her relief and haste to find a seat away from the center of attention, she'd ended up on the seat that the Uchiha girl favored. She cursed herself for it, knowing that she'd now have to stand up and move all the way across the classroom with everyone's eyes staring at her. Not once did the thought of resistance cross her mind. Only 2 people could match up with the Uchiha girl when it came to the ninja arts, and she definitely wasn't one of them. She prepared to stand up, and the bad situation suddenly got much worse as she felt a hand on her shoulder. "What are you doing, Yuzum?" her cousin said, staring down the Uchiha girl with his head tilted to the side. "Your little cousin is on my seat," she said, stepping closer to the boy who had taken the space between them. Shikaheim wanted to roll up and about ball like a child and cry her feelings out. Because how had this gotten this bad? She knew that she should be thankful to her cousin for stepping up to defend her, but she wanted nothing more than to scream at him for standing up and involving himself in this. If she hadn't already been the center of attention, then having the 2 best students in the class in a face-off over her choice of seating position would ensure it. "I'm sure no seats have any names on them. The seats are first come, first served, Yuzum. Sensei has made this clear more than once, I know. And so do you," he said simply, weathering the glare that she tossed at him with no discernible reaction. "I've sat on the same chair for 17 months, Senju. Don't play with me." Her voice rose now, making Shikaheim shrink further in the chair. No longer a whisper that promised violence, her voice was now a snarl that assured it. "Doesn't matter," he said, and in the blink of an eye, he caught a punch that had been sent flying at his head. Now, the entire class was on high alert. Uchiha Yuzum proved to be deserving of her class ranking as the number 1 student by sweeping her leg forward and sending a high kick slamming for his head. Her cousin simply released the hand in his grip before moving his head backwards an inch to allow her foot to sail past his face with no effect before rushing at her. Shikaheim had very little doubts about how this would go. It was only her cousin's terrible shuriken jutsu marks that made him second place to the Uchiha girl. It was a testament to his skill that the gap between them was still so close when one considered that he was dead last in the class when it came to kunai and shuriken throwing. He stepped into the Uchiha girl's space before she could recover from the attack and released a duo of quick jabs at her face. The first hit. She used the momentum to send herself rolling backwards. She came up weaving hand seals, only for her hands to be caught in a solid grip before she could continue. "A great fireball jutsu in a closed classroom is more stupid than anything I've ever seen any of you attempt," Uraraka-sensei's voice rang out. Shikaheim absently checked the clock and noted that they still had about 10 minutes until the bell was supposed to ring. That, at the very least, went a step in confirming her theory. "Senju-san, Uchiha-san. Detention. You will both be staying behind after class today, and this incident will be going on both your records," he said, before moving back to the front of the class and picking up a stick of chalk. "Today was supposed to mark the beginning of survival and camping training, but since you all clearly have too much energy, we'll be doing some endurance training instead," he said, the rest of the class predictably erupting in mutinous groans and whispers. Even her cousin winced at the announcement. Endurance training wasn't fun for anyone. Especially now that Uraraka-sensei had begun adding genjutsu detection training to the mix. "Chop, chop. You should be at the lineup already. Last there gets to do an extra lap for good measure," Sensei said, and the class moved almost as one. Her cousin was, predictably, at the very front of the line with his unholy speed. She hastened to take off and join the others. She couldn't end up being the one to take the extra lap. Sarutobi Omoikane. He lounged against the tree stump while taking a look around the gathering. He hadn't thought that this would be what the gatherings would look like when he'd first heard of them and pursued an invitation. He'd expected secret training of powerful ninjutsu or something like that, but while Izuku-san and Shorarama-san did show off some ninjutsu on their own, it definitely was not the center of the meetings. These were, and he still felt strange thinking it, almost like leisurely gatherings. The idea that the Senju heir, the cousin to Uchiha clan head, and so many other clan heirs would gather during the weekends to play music and games would have been ridiculous to him if he wasn't looking right at it. "How's the grill coming along, Choni?" He heard the Inuzuka say from his position opposite him and turned his attention to the Akimichi, who was expertly managing a large outdoor grill and flipping pieces of meat on it. Next to the grill was a platter of various fruits and vegetables that had been provided for the entire gathering but would only end up being touched by the Senju, who refused to eat meat for whatever reason. Speaking of the Senju, he was in the complete opposite end of the courtyard in front of a series of targets. Next to him stood Uchiha Izuku, and they whispered between themselves for a bit before Senju walked backwards and primed the bow. In the space between seconds, the bull's eye of all three targets had arrows sticking out of them. How? He asked himself, suddenly sitting upright. He heard the Senju bark a laugh as the Uchiha boy seemingly shared his shock at the state of things. Play us something, Kizuru. Izuku owes us a song, the Senju said, walking away from the targets and dragging his Uchiha friend with him. Senju Shorarama v Uchiha Izuku, Uraraka-sensei said, gesturing to the raised platform set aside for the sparring matches. The friendly duo wasted no time in marching to the platform and taking their places. Ready to kiss the ground? Shorarama-san asked with a smile on his face. Yeah. This isn't going to be anything like last time. Before Shorarama could offer a reply on his own, Uraraka-sensei interrupted, commanding them to form the seal of confrontation. They executed it in unison, and once Sensei's hand fell, the Uchiha was on the move. He ran forward in quick, long strides before kicking at his opponent's head. The boy with hair like silk weaved around the attack with ease before trying to step into his friend's guard. Izuku sent off 2 quick jabs. Both were dodged in succession. The Senju went on the attack, sending a knife hand at his friend's throat that forced him to flinch backwards. He wasted no time and took advantage of the hesitation, stomping on the other boy's foot and refusing to let up. Izuku's attempt to pull his foot out from under his friend was met with harsh resistance. Shorarama unleashed 3 quick jabs into his friend's face before lifting his foot and allowing him to backpedal. Izuku stumbled backwards for a second before abandoning his training and diving right at his opponent. They landed on the floor with a harsh crash, the Uchiha on top. He scrambled to press his weight down on Shorarama before lifting his upper body a bit. He wailed into his opponent, punch after punch, hitting the Senju boy in the face even if they failed to do much damage on their own, as Izuku couldn't get much force behind them. As Izuku pulled his hand back for another punch, Shori's head followed him, slamming into his friend's forehead and sending the boy reeling. Suddenly and smoothly, Shorarama used his footwork to grab a hold of Izuku's waist before rolling them over so he was the one on top. And when on top, he wasted no time. 3 punches in and all of Izuku's resistance had faded. Shorarama landed 2 more punches before standing up and pulling his dazed friend upright to join him. Good show, boys. Now form the seal of reconciliation, Sensei said. Izuku needed a second or two to get his wits about him, but once he did, he formed the seal in good faith, and they left the platform. Inuzuka Inukuro v Uchiha Yuzum, Sensei said, making Omoikane's sigh to himself. There was only one way this was going to go, and it wouldn't be fun for anyone watching. The Uchiha girl was way too aggressive and brutal, while the Inuzuka boy had much more pride than common sense. She'd beat him black and blue while he'd keep standing up to take more and more. He was a glutton for punishment. Just like he predicted, the fight began with Inukuro running right at Uchiha-san. She weaved underneath both his swipes before punching him in the side. Kidney shot, he heard Shorarama wince to himself from behind him. Inukuro flinched but showed no more pain than that as he commanded his legs into a kick that Uchiha-san had an easy time bending underneath. She sprung up with an uppercut that he stepped away from. It was the beginning of a combo, however. Not one that Inukuro was well poised to deal with. She punched at his solar plexus, forcing him to block before she kicked him in the shin. He stepped back, but she used that opportunity to tangle her feet with his and force him to the ground. She stepped backwards, allowing him ample time to stand up. He didn't take the display of sportsmanship well and dove right at her just like Izuku had done with Shorarama. The difference here was that he telegraphed every aspect of his dive, and Uchiha-san had ample time to react. She jumped upwards, stretching out a single foot that Inukuro's head slammed into. He fell to the ground, battered and unconscious. Kurama Kizuru 9 years before the Second Great Shinobi World War. He watched his favorite classmate walk into the room with an easy smile on his face. He just finished with his assessment tests, and like exactly everyone expected, HR seemed to have had an easy time of it. Of course he did. None of the outs they'd asked Kizuru to do had been things Shori had had any difficulty with at all. After all, it had been him who'd helped Kizuru learn everything it would take to pass the exams. Especially the ninjutsu. For a family with a preternatural disposition for genjutsu, his family had an equally famous aversion to most forms of ninjutsu. The fact that the academy required to C-rank elemental jutsu of one's own element as a precondition for graduation would probably have ruined him if not for Shori. How was it? He heard Izuku ask. Of course, he would be the first to ask. Kizuru noted how the kind boy's cousin paid increased attention to the answer that Shori would give. At the beginning, he'd been very much against the friendship the boy was building with Shori, especially since his cousin was very publicly and openly doing her best to ensure that Shori lost the top spot at the academy. He thought the boy had been some form of Trojan horse like Shori had told them about in that story. But 3 years together, and he had to accept that the boy was mostly as genuine as he appeared to be. Even if Kizuru still thought he could see something sharp lurking behind the boy's eyes when he thought no one was looking. That was the hardest test I've faced in the academy, he said with a hearty laugh, forcing Kizuru to crack a smile. Looking around showed him that most of the class shared the sentiment. Shori was famous for never finding any of their exams or tests difficult in the slightest. Even when, 6 months ago, Uraraka-sensei had given them an impassable test to teach them about failure and the dangers of arrogance, Shori was the only one who didn't have any difficulty with the questions. He'd even somehow managed to get a perfect score on mathematics problems that were so far out of the syllabus that even Chunin would have had difficulty solving them. That's not a lot to go off of, Toshiro said, making him smile and shrug again before he walked in and took his seat in between Kizuru and Izuku while Toshiro himself was called in to take his test. Your test sounds very different from mine, he said, turning to his friend. You mean they didn't make you fight a Chunin as well? He asked with a laugh that rang hollow in the face of the class' sudden silence. He'd fought a Chunin. A middle-tier ninja. Sure, Chunin weren't necessarily the strongest of opponents since their strength could vary wildly. He could have fought a Chunin from the cryptoanalysis squad or something, but the fact that he'd fought one, taken shorter than everyone else had on their test, and still come out unscathed was a feat beyond feats. If Kizuru wasn't personally aware of his terrible lying skills, he'd have accused Shori of trying to pull their legs. He could see some of their classmates coming to that conclusion on their own, and he almost scared in disappointment. Shori never smiled when he lied. He did it with a straight face. Sure, it was the perfect way to deliver something that one wanted to be taken seriously, but considering he'd not even been able to avoid cracking a smile when he had to break the news to Inukuro that he'd broken his puppy's leg in their friendly spar, Kizuru had concluded that he'd smile no matter what. Only when he lied did he manage to avoid it. What do you think our teams will be? Izuku asked, making Kizuru's slam back to attention. Team assignments. That was one thing that he'd been both thinking about and trying not to think about at the same time. After all, it could turn out very good or very bad for him. Uraraka-sensei hadn't given them much information on the matter. In fact, all he knew could be summed up in 3 points. 1. Their scores in the final exams and throughout the academy would be taken into account. He didn't know precisely how they would be considered, but it could range from putting the highest scoring students together or trying to balance it out by averaging a mix of the scores. He felt the latter would be less likely. Right from the beginning of their time in the academy, it had always been about putting the best of the best together. That was why he'd put so much effort into these exams. He'd studied his arse off, day after day and night after night. He'd punched posts until his fists bled and his aunt screamed at him for taking things too deeply. She never felt the pressure he did. The pressure to beat the best of the best that the strongest clans had to offer to make sure he ended up in the right team. 2. Their compatibility as people would matter. This was one of the places where he knew that he had the advantage over most of the others. He and Shori were friends. The best of friends, if he were being precise. The only one that could even vaguely be considered as close to Shori as he was Izuku, and being on the same team with the both of them would be perfect. He'd take the Uchiha as a third over most others. Especially that Nara who thought that she could intrude on their friendship simply because of their familial relations. 3. The balance of their abilities. Shori was good at everything. Everything that mattered, at least. But Kizuru was one of the few people in the class who could claim to be better than him at any particular ninja art. As the Kurama clan head, he was born for genjutsu. But he hadn't stopped there. He trained with his aunt until he'd gotten so skilled that he was even better than their Chunin sensei. His aunt called his genjutsu potential the highest she'd ever seen. Hopefully, that would mean that he'd be put on the same team with Shori to make up for any genjutsu deficiencies that might exist in the team. He was sure of it. He became even more sure when on the very next day, the class rankings were posted. As expected, everyone in Class A had passed the final exams, but the rankings were beyond what most people could have foreseen. He walked to the board with a light feeling in his chest as he stared at his position on the list. 1. Senju Shorarama. 2. Uchiha Yuzum. 3. Uchiha Izuku. 4. Kurama Kizuru. No one would be insane enough to put Shori and angry Uchiha on the same team, so he was sure of it. The 3 of them. He, Izuku, and Shori would be on the same team. Perfection. Few things could ever be so glorious. Toshiro Takahata. The exams had been hard. The hardest thing he'd ever had to do. He'd trained his arsenal off for it, but even with that, he'd just barely been able to last long enough in the ring for the Chunin to count his taijutsu as a pass, and after doing and redoing the jutsu every day for weeks, he'd been able to execute all 5 jutsu required of him to graduate just without keeling over from chakra exhaustion. Shurinkan jutsu was easy enough, but the addition of the hourglass to make sure that he hit all the targets in such a small time frame, and moving targets to make it even harder had been one hell of a curveball. He'd legitimately wondered how Shori passed that section of the test. Unless it was with that bow of his, the Senju boy had famously terrible aim. All his work had paid off in the end. He'd been ranked last in Class 3A, but that was the wrong way to look at it. He was ranked 12 out of 50 students that graduated the Konoha Academy this year. Sure, some of them were holdovers from last year who'd been forced to retake the exams, but that was how life works sometimes. He, the son of a librarian, was going to have a Jounin sensei and be placed in the same team as members of the best clans Konoha had to offer. He'd seen it the looks that he got when he got home each day. It was even worse on Saturday, when everyone knew he'd be spending the entire day at the Senju clan complex. He was the only one he knew outside of the clan children at the academy that had gotten to talk to Hokage-sama in person. He was special. "How did you do?" Mom asked as he ran through the door, and he wasted no time to jump on top of her. He'd had a smile on his face from the moment he'd left the academy, and couldn't wait to share his joy with his mother. "I passed," he said, wincing as his mother winced from the loudness of his voice. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but couldn't keep his joy down as she picked him up and twirled him in the air. "Don't be. It's good to be excited. My boy, you're going to be a ninja. My baby boy is going to be a ninja," she sang as she took him in the air. Years of training meant he didn't feel any of the dizziness that would have been par for the course, but he still had a good time, smiling as she smiled and laughing as she laughed. Toshiro loved to see how like this. It made it clear to him just how young his mother was. She'd given birth to him when she wasn't even 10 years older than he was now. She was younger than all his classmates' parents, but she looked older than most of them. Not when she smiled, though. When she smiled, her blonde hair came to life. Everything about her came to life at once. "I'll be the best ninja in the whole world," he told her, making her laugh _, "and then I'll find the bastard that put me in you and tear his intestines from his body _," he said next, but not out loud. Not to her. He sat at his regular seat, far at the back. He liked it for 1,000,001 reasons. For one, it gave him a very good view of his role model in the class, Senju Shorarama. For another, it put him a fair distance away from the class' most volatile elements, Uchiha Yuzum and Inuzuka Inukuro. The boy from the Inuzuka clan was much less likely to attack him than the angry Uchiha girl, but what he considered playtime could lead to serious injury if one wasn't careful. That dog of his was dangerous, as well, and Toshiro had learned from a young age to avoid animals. Dangerous creature, he thought to himself, unsure if he was referring to the creature himself, or its owner. Sometimes, Toshiro felt there was no difference between them. Shori disagreed, but he had a habit of seeing nothing but the best in people. The Inuzuka boy was a beast, and so Toshiro would never keep his eyes away from him for long. It was only a few minutes until class started, and he watched Shori laugh as he spoke to the other Uchiha Izuku. Their conversations were always on a variety of topics, so unless he went closer or focused chakra into his eats to eavesdrop, then he was clueless as to what the conversation could be about. That was one skill Shori had. He could talk to anyone about anything. Toshiro had considered himself the most well-read person in his age group, but that was only until he discovered just how much time Shori dedicated to reading on a daily basis. He'd have thought that the heir to the premier ninja clan would have all his time set aside for training, but finding out that he scheduled every resting minute for reading had been a wake-up call for him. Even when Shori stopped training his body, he never stopped training his mind. Even now, he was still training. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, especially with how baggy his kimono tended to be, but Toshiro had better eyes than most. He was a stickler for detail. And when the wind moved through his clothing, one could spot, for a few seconds, the weights that he wore across every limb. Sitting down, standing, every movement was a form of training when one made use of ninja weights. Toshiro had considered doing it as well, but when he noticed the prices on his visit to the supply store, all his enthusiasm had dried out. Especially when the helpful lady at the store told him that it wouldn't be very useful for someone that was his age unless they had a medical ninja checking up on them on a nearly daily basis to heal the damage they were doing to themselves the right way and make sure they didn't accidentally get crippled. For the heir of the Senju, that kind of expense would make sense. Not for him. Not when Mom worked extra hours at the archive to make sure they had enough for rent and his ninja supplies. "Quiet down," Uraraka-sensei said as he appeared in front of them. "As I told you when I gave you these," he pointed at the headbands on their heads, most of their heads, he amended to himself. Shori's headband was worn around his neck, and crazy Uchiha girl wore hers on her bicep in the same position as Nara-san. You are shinobi of the village hidden in the leaves now. That means you are to be the best of the best. You are now carriers of the will of fire and must be trusted to uphold both the will and the ideals of the village in all your dealings, he continued in a serious tone before suddenly pulling out a clipboard from nowhere. You already know that as members of Class A, you will be sent out in teams of 3 with specially chosen Jounin sensei. This is a special opportunity that you must be grateful for, he said, pinning them all with his stare. Uraraka sensei was something else. He'd been like a father to most of them in their time in the academy, and Toshiro knew that he'd be far from the only one who'd missed their sensei after leaving. Here are the teams. Once I call your names, your Jounin sensei will walk in and take you with them, he said before taking an audible breath. Team 1 will be made up of Higuyuram, Inuzuka Inukuro, and Aburame Shiba, and you will be under the tutelage of Jounin Shimura Danzo. At his words, a man appeared in the doorway. He'd entered the classroom without opening the door? Or he'd opened the door without them noticing somehow? No, Occam's razor, as Shari called it. The simplest explanation. He'd always been there. Just under a genjutsu that prevented them from noticing. Even Hyuga-san was shocked, so that meant his genjutsu had been enough to fool even her advanced senses. Follow me, little branches, he said before disappearing in a shunshin. All 3 of his students looked between themselves, confused. Head to training ground 1, Uraraka-sensei said, taking pity on them. Team 2 will have Yamanaka Inoken, Naro Shikaheim, and Akimichi Choni, under Sarutobi Benzaiten. Their sensei walked in through the door with an easy swagger. He was the type of man who you'd see on the street and bestow with the epithet, cool. Sarutobi Benzaiten was a cool man, with his full beard and broad shoulders. We don't have all day. Let's get going, kids, he said, waiting for all his students to stand up before walking out at a sedate pace with them in tow. Team 3 Uchiha Izuku, Kurama Kizuru, and Sarutobi Omoikane under Uchiha Kagami. The class went dead silent at that. Even when the Jounin entered the classroom, no one paid him any attention. Instead, all the genin in the room were looking between 2 people, Shori and Uchiha Yuzum. What were the people in charge of the academy smoking? Putting Shori and crazy Uchiha together was a recipe for disaster. Even worse for him, he was on the same team with the both of them. He was a dead man. A very dead man. When his sensei asked them to follow, Kurama-san boldly resisted the order, preferring to stare at his friend in worry until Shori sent him off with an easy smile. Team 4 Uraraka sensei said, addressing them since they were the only ones in the classroom at this point. Hataki Tsukumo shall be your sensei, he said, and then a boy walked in. White hair and tall willowy frame marked him as a very handsome fellow. The only problem was that he didn't look to be much older than them. Not up to a decade older, for sure. He looked like a teenager, if Toshiro was being honest. Of course, it was just his luck to be put with 2 people who wanted to kill each other, and a sensei that had the least experience of all the options. He sighed. Hataki Tsukumo. This was realistically the best team he could have asked for. Sure, the one with the Uchiha and the Kurama heir was interesting, and the Akimichi, Nara, and Yamanaka combo were going to be lethal no matter what, but this was the kind of team that tales were told of. The Senju heir, top of his class in the academy with the power to use B-rank jutsu as a genin, the youngest child of the Uchiha clan head who showed potential that far outstripped any of her older brothers in fire release or even the visual acuity of the Sharingan, and last and most definitely least, a civilian-born child with grades that outstripped the other 2 academically and the ability to recall and deduce information at a pace that put even the most prodigious Nara to shame. Like he'd already said, this was a team that stories were told of, but looking at them made him sure that this team wouldn't be getting any songs unless they went through some serious work. First of all, the Uchiha girl was glaring at both her teammates like they'd joined and severely offended her scrawled multiple instances and situations. That had to be the first thing to go. Second was the bow at the back of the Senju heir. Tsukumo doubted that the heir of the second Hokage would walk around with a weapon he couldn't wield, but a bow was not a shinobi's weapon, and if he'd found some workaround, then perhaps a more discreet means to storage could be fine. The bow spelt him out as a Kong range specialist from miles away. Knowing his taijutsu scores, it was possible that the bow itself was a red herring, designed to make opponents underestimate his close-range potential and punish them when they failed. He left it as a maybe. The thing he'd definitely be removing was that smile. The Uchiha girl was angry, and he was perfectly pleased by it. He'd whip enough teamwork to turn them into real shinobi of the leaf into them. It was either that or they never leave the village on a mission, he swore to himself. The third teammate had a million things that needed fixing. The first was that fact that he was actively shying away from his teammate. While he knew that the girl would have no trouble tearing down the Tekahata boy if she got the go-ahead, it was still shameful for him to cower away from aggression in such an open manner. No shinobi of Konoha would be showing that kind of behavior. Not even in the face of unbeatable odds. With all this in mind, he spoke his first sentence to them after summoning them to their chosen training ground. My first impression of all of you is that you suck, he said to them in a deadpan tone. At his words, their reactions were telling. The Uchiha turned her aggression to him, trying to burn him with her gaze. The Senju merely smiled even wider like he'd heard some sort of joke and relaxed his shoulders. Takahata shied even further into himself in the face of the false criticism. But it's my job to make you suck less. Or it could be. Depends on if you can pass my test, he said, channeling the words of his first sensei as he leaned on the older man's expertise and wisdom not to mess up here. Test? No points for guessing which one of the three responded almost instantly with venom in their tone. I took you for many things, but not simple, Uchiha Yuzumi, he said, ignoring the pitiful killing intent she shot at him. He chuckled to himself. You see, passing the academy test proves that you are good enough to be genin of Konoha. But that doesn't tell me anything but the bare minimum. It definitely doesn't tell me that you deserve me spending even a second of time on you. That's what this test is going to do. If you turn out to be worth my time, then I'll train you. If not, it's to the reserves with you lot, he said to them, watching the words sink in. Uchiha raged, Takahata shrunk, and Senju smiled. Sakumo got the feeling that he was going to eventually understand where the Chunin sensei had been coming from when he'd written in his assessment, Senju Shorirama is one least suited to the life of shinobi. Just purely on his mentality. His skills are better than mine already, but he takes everything as a joke of some sort. A joke only he sees. I do not feel he has the potential to be a ninja of Konoha. He will either break on his first mission, or turn out to be the kind of monster that Konoha cannot truly control. Recommendation, fail _. Of course, writing that about the second Hokage's grandnephew was not going to end well for him, but he applauded the man's dedication to his students. That had to be the only thing that would motivate some no-name to recommend failing the heir to Konoha's premier clan. Even Sakumo, with all his pedigree, would never dare failing the children in front of him. Getting both the Senju and Uchiha on his case at the same time would be political suicide of the most comedic order. His enemies would most likely take breaks from delighting at his suffering to pity him. Either way, he had to get the measure of these children. And first things first would be robbing the Uchiha girl of that unfocused aggression and seeing if he could get the Senju boy to take something seriously. When is the test, sensei? Now, of course. And as for what it is, the sun is at its highest point. Survive until sundown, and you will be my genin, he said, giving them a completely impossible task. At his words, they all snapped into action faster than he'd expected. He tilted his head backwards to dodge a boot that had swung right for his head. He observed the Senju boy chuckling as he ran from the training ground and left both his teammates behind. Toshiro Takahata. Of course, she didn't waste a second trying to do something actually useful like coming up with a plan, or even letting them know what she was going to do ahead of time. Yes, Toshiro, and he was sure Shori as well, had known that the girl would attack once she got the permission to. It was her entire personality, after all. But couldn't she have learned a new trick or two after graduation? He absently noticed Shori disappearing from the corner of his eyes as he whipped out two shrunken from his weapon purse and tossed them at his sensei at an angle. Mom said that these were supposed to test their teamwork, and as long as he showed some ability to work with the other two, then he'd pass. He was certain of it. Both his shuriken ended up proving more of a hindrance than a help to angry Uchiha-san as she heard them coming and disengaged. There had been very little risk of her getting hit by the stars, but part of him facepalmed at expecting her to trust in that with no guarantees. Engage in taijutsu, I'll help out from a distance, he signed at her in the sign language that Konoha had once favored for use within the Umbu. He knew she spoke it, as he'd seen her use it with her brothers before. Shori also knew it as well, but it was expected for the Hokage's heir to know every language within Konoha. Yuzum knowing it had been a surprise for him when he'd first noticed. It had made him curious as to what her brothers did exactly. The fact that Mom hadn't said anything about them, and had just gone silent when he asked meant only one thing: Umbu. She ignored his words and began to run through seals. It was a blur and ended with the tiger seal. He did well to jump backwards. He'd seen enough of the Uchiha girl's ninjutsu to know that this wouldn't end well for their would-be sensei. He was right. A massive ball of fire, large enough to completely block Toshiro's view of their opponent. Their sensei, a jounin, didn't seem too bothered by the jutsu as Toshiro didn't see him dive out of the way. In fact, as a shape appeared through the flames, it looked like their sensei had done the opposite. He dove right through Uchiha Yuzum's flames, none the worse for wear, and slammed into her with a composed savagery. That was the only phrase Toshiro could think of. Their previous taijutsu exchange had been brief, but it had been mostly their sensei dodging out of the way as she relentlessly pursued. Now it was as far from that as possible. It was a beatdown. First of all, He near folded her in half with a knee to her stomach. She'd reeled backwards but done nothing to avoid the follow-up punch to her temple. She tried to lift her hands to block the next jab, but it was an obvious feint for a kidney punch that their sensei delivered with punishing strength. She spat out blood and sensei used the opportunity to hit her with a palm to the face that broke her nose in one clean strike. Fuck, Toshiro thought to himself. This wouldn't end well. Shori had disappeared once Uchiha-san attacked. Of course he had. He'd probably seen this coming and decided that he'd be better served hiding from their sensei than taking him on in a straight fight. Toshiro prepared to jump away and attempt the same when he suddenly found himself pinned to the ground. He saw a vision there and then. If he moved, he'd die. Not in one fixed way, in a million different ones. Each more brutal than the last. He turned to find his sensei watching him with something resembling amusement in his eyes. His sensei was standing straight, not a wrinkle on his impeccably pressed jounin uniform. Not a single lock of spiky hair out of place from the organized mess that had caught Toshiro's attention back in the classroom. He looked to all the world that he just had a pleasant stroll in the park and not a life or death battle with who was arguably the most dangerous genin in all of Konoha. He'd put money on Shori in a fight, if he was a gambling man, but he'd still consider the Uchiha girl as much more dangerous. There was just a ferocity in her that he never saw anywhere. That was why the fact that she'd remained slumped in their sensei's pseudo-grip made for terrifying thinking. He'd beaten the fight out of her. This was the same girl who'd fought through a broken arm, and used same arm to shove a punch into a shocked Shori's face, whining her the only spar she'd ever won against him. The fact that it was the last time Uraraka-sensei had allowed them to spar had also said a lot. In a blink he found a blur heading for him and didn't even notice when he moved his body to catch Uchiha Yuzum as she was tossed in the air at him like a rag doll. Stay here. I'll go get that wayward teammate of yours and teach him a thing or two about abandoning one's comrades, was all he heard as his sensei disappeared in the wind. Tsunade Senju. There was only one word she felt was appropriate for describing her little cousin. Sure, Uncle Tobarama would rather know him as a prodigy and Grandma Mito would rather know him as a sweetheart, but at the core of it, her little cousin was in. It didn't matter how naturally talented he was when it came to the ninja arts. All that mattered was the fact that her little cousin couldn't take anything with an appropriate level of seriousness and was consistently pushed by the voices in his head to apply his deviant sense of humor to every situation. Case in point right now. I said I need to go inside to get my student, the man said, visibly frustrated. At least to her senses, though was visibly frustrated. She'd known Hitaki Tsukumo for years now and could just tell from the way he reached up to scratch his headband that he was near the breaking point. If it had been any other clan building, she would bet he'd have already bypassed the guards and made his way inside. Okay, that's enough. Let him pass, she said to the gate guard. A man by the name of Poki, she was reasonably certain. But Tsunade-sama, Shorama-sama said he began, but she interrupted with an easy plan. Good thing I can countermand his orders. Even beyond that, from now on, any of my cousin's orders relating to matters like this have to be approved by either myself, my grandmother, or my granduncle. Is that understood? She asked rhetorically, already turning her back and signaling for the older jounin to follow her. Thank you for that, he said to her, rubbing his hair and not meeting her eyes. Hitaki Tsukumo was a legend in his own right. She'd never gotten to see him fight, but Jiraiya had run a mission or two with the man and claimed that he'd probably be able to beat all three of them working together. Don't thank me. Or if you have to, please do it by kicking my cousin's arse for me. I can't do it myself because our grandmother would throw a fit. She deflected the gratitude. But tell me why my cousin has seen fit to hide himself in the compound and bar your entrance. Aren't you supposed to be testing him? She asked, probing into her cousin's actions. The boy was difficult to understand, even at his most cooperative. He was nowhere close to that today. I gave his team the mission to evade capture until sundown, and he interpreted the orders to mean abandon your teammates and retreat to your clan's protection, he said with audible irritation in his voice. She resisted the urge to chuckle, but she couldn't prevent the smile that broke across her face. It was a crafty solution, to be sure. If not for her being around, he'd have gotten away with it. Hitaki Tsukumo was too disciplined to break into the Senju clan compound even with the good reason he had. What would end up happening would be that he'd spend some time outside the gates, trying to convince the stubborn guards and then given up before he'd have ended snapping at them. It was a good plan, and she told Tsukumo the same. I agree. I would have been far more amused if he'd bothered taking his teammates with him for his stunt. At least, it would have shown that he had some ability to work well with others beyond using them to alleviate his boredom. I told my uncle that putting him on a three-man team, particularly this one, wouldn't end well. He works best with those who know how to think the way he does. A combo with the Uchiha boy and the Kurama heir would have been something to behold, she put forward. Sadly, we will never see the fruits of that. But I do agree slightly with the Hokage's reasoning behind this team. If they manage to get over the worst aspects of their personalities, and if the two divergent elements manage to get over their animosity with each other, then there'd be very little this team won't be able to take care of once they reach their full potential. He was trying to build another version of your team, 3 individuals capable of battling Kage-level opponents once put together. He told her with a significant look, and she nodded. I guess that means you understand what it means for you to be chosen as the sensei for such a team, she told him. He merely nodded and they continued to walk in silence. She allowed him walk with his thoughts. He'd been placed in charge of the futures of 2 of Konoha's biggest clans, the 2 biggest, in fact, and there was nothing he could do to refuse. He'd have eyes on him whatever he did from now on, and he'd have students with intrusive and powerful families. She'd try her best with her granduncle, but she knew that if Tobirama Senju ever disagreed with the manner in which his heir was being taught, then he wouldn't hesitate to make his opinion heard. We've arrived, she said as they stood in front of the clan library. Of course this is where he'd end up. Hashirama Senju. You gave 2 seconds to get out of the library or I promise you won't like what I do when I come in myself, she said it near the top of her voice, and in less than the time it had taken for Tsukumo to look at her in shock at the volume, her cousin appeared at the doorway with a finger rubbing at his left ear. Pretty sure you ruptured an eardrum with that one, cuz he said irreverently. Good. Maybe I'll even heal you from that when I'm working on the rest of your injuries after your sensei is done with you. At her words, he finally turned to see the man next to her who was leaking killing intent like a waterfall. He instantly paled and turned to run before he was suddenly sent flying by a kick to the midsection. She tracked his flight path and noticed he was heading towards the training ground in the compound. At least Tsukumo wasn't so far gone that he'd beat the boy in the residential district. She watched as her cousin's body burst into smoke and 'twas replaced by a log that hit the ground at the entrance to the training field and shattered to smithereens. This was going to be fun. Facing each other now, both sensei and student waited for nary a second before bursting into movement. With a shunshin, Hashirama was just able to dodge out of the way of his sensei's first strike. Distance gave him the time and space to knock that useless bow of his with 2 arrows. It was like every time someone told him bows weren't ninja weapons, he got more and more determined to keep up with it. Neither arrow did anything to hinder Hatake Tsukumo's pursuit of his annoying student until the ground rumbled for a second before turning into a massive pit of pure mud between them. Hatake flexed his knee for a second before pushing off and scaling the entire thing in one go. It was a mistake as Hashirama had put down his bow and was running through seals. A massive wave of water from the pond attached to the training ground rushed at his sensei in mid-air. The man then did something she'd never seen done before. At least not with jutsu above D rank. He formed a half-ram seal and just allowed the water wave hit him with no effect. He landed on the ground and then burst at his student again. He knocked the foolish bow again, this time enhancing all 3 arrows with wind-natured chakra. Tsukumo treated the attack no differently than he had with the first one, and dodged away from all 3 arrows with contemptuous ease. Even worse, this time he was able to catch him before he could escape with a shunshin. The first kick was blocked with the bow, but said bow was wrenched from her cousin's hand by the second. They exchanged furious taijutsu, and she marveled at how much progress he'd made with the skill at such a young age. He fought like a hyuga, but with technical proficiency only, he was far above even the most skilled genin she'd ever seen Orochimaru all those years ago. He leaned out of the way of a punch that would have made his brain ring and retaliated with a palm thrust that was reeking of chakra to her senses. Tsukumo dodged and then leaned downwards to sweep his legs off the ground. Her cousin kept his footing by jumping in the air for a quick second while forming a single-hand seal. The wind bullet jutsu hit Tsukumo, did nothing, and then he took a kick straight to his stomach that had him coughing up blood. She resisted the urge to wince since she knew that kick at least had to have broken a rib or 2. The moment the kick hit, her cousin collapsed to the ground holding his stomach and whimpering. When Tsukumo turned to her with a raised eyebrow, she merely shrugged. The hyuga were in charge of his taijutsu education. Of course the pretentious pricks had done nothing to fix up his pain resistance. Stand up, brat, Tsukumo commanded, and in the span of a second, he had to lean out of the way of a blade that threatened to stab through his left eye. Nice acting, he commented before blurring with speed. A single chop to her cousin's and neck rendered him unconscious. Do you mind healing him and the rest of the team, Senju-san? Tsukumo asked, and while she'd have normally said no, a cough rang out across the clearing. Yes. She'd love to, her grandmother said, walking deeper into the training ground and beginning to prod her unconscious grandson with her cane. Tsukumo didn't need an extra second to begin falling over himself to greet the old woman. I would have expected his training to have gone further, she said idly, after completing the formalities. He's been focusing on a lot more things than simply getting better at fighting these days, she said, feeling the inexplicable urge to defend the. She could see in her grandmother's eyes who exactly she was comparing Hashirama to. She'd once been a recipient of looks just like that one. Everyone expecting the second coming of Hashirama. That expectation might have explained away her cousin's general demeanor if she wasn't well aware of the evil that had laid in his heart from birth. A born, he was. Tsukumo Hatake. So what did you do wrong? He asked, talking to the freshly healed team of 3, and doing his best not to react to the guests at the training ground. If he'd known that the matriarch of the Senju clan would tag along once he asked for Tsunade Senju's help, then he would have gone without it. I should have hidden at the Hyuga clan compound instead, his most troublesome student said with a sore tone until he heard a sound of wood striking skull. At least the presence of the Senju matriarch would maintain the good behavior of her charge. No. You failed the moment you abandoned your teammates. Those who abandon their comrades are less than scum, not worthy to live in this ninja world. Do you understand me, Hashirama Senju? He asked, flooding the clearing with his killing intent. The boy shakily nodded, performing a better job than his teammates, but still unable to completely shake off the effects of his killing intent. No. No, you don't. Not yet, at least. But I promise that you won't be getting any missions until I beat that into your head, he said, making all 3 students wince. Only the Uchiha and Senju had felt the strength of his displeasure, but the civilian-born third had gotten a front-row seat to what would happen if they failed to perform up to standard. I'll tell all 3 of you what you did wrong in turn. Uchiha Yuzum, you ignored your teammates and went in on your own. You also ignored your teammate's plans when he communicated them to you. Takahata Toshiro, you are weak and you failed to work around your uncooperative teammate in an effective manner. Hashirama Senju, you abandoned your teammates. In spite of all your individual failings, I see potential in this team. I will be passing you, and in the next few months, I will beat some teamwork into you or break you and reforge you as a team. Whichever comes first. Now you are dismissed. Meet here again by 0600 hours tomorrow. Tsukumo Hatake. When he had said that he would beat teamwork into them, he had not expected that they would make him have to actually do it. He thought that their first experience against a completely superior opponent would teach them that they had to work together, but he had clearly been mistaken. Now, they tried their best to work around each other, with the Uchiha girl unwilling to stomach even the thought of relying on any of her teammates, and the Senju being too consumed with his amusement at very unamusing situations to spend time thinking on working with his teammate. He would never have expected that the civilian would turn out to be his favorite student, but it had happened. He caught the kick aimed at his leg and then stretched the limb before moving to snap it in 2. The boy dissolved in mud immediately after. The Senju family knew what he was trying to teach, but they were also perfectly willing to encourage their scion's foolhardy quest to overcome him on his lonesome. Hokage-sama probably saw it as a win. The boy they'd struggled to make focus on his Ina arts as a priority was now growing by leaps and bounds as he struggled to get strong enough to beat his Jounin sensei. His body flickered backwards as a massive fire missile tore through the air where he'd once been. Working together, the 2 of them would have been able to make any regular Jounin sweat. But with the way, they ignored each other and seemed dead set on getting the other caught up as collateral damage from their attacks. Even a Chunin could dispatch them with careful planning. He flexed his chakra coils and broke from the genjutsu that the 3rd member of the team tried to put him under. Takahata Toshiro could work well with Hashirama Senju, but he'd learned to look out for it, and now the boy was determined to harmonize his attacks with that of the Uchiha girl as well. He was the glue that gave the entire arrangement some semblance of teamwork. Senju followed him in his shunshin and appeared with a kick aimed for his head again. The same attack twice told him something was wrong, and he was proven accurate as the boss tore it to shreds as 7 different air bullets shot through it, heading for him. He surrounded himself with chakra, leaning on his trained wind release affinity, and nullified the jutsu before it hit him. At least, the constant spars had been just as useful for training his skills as it had for training theirs. Jutsu nullification was quickly transforming from a cool idea in the cradle to a working technique that could turn aside even B-ranked offensive techniques with the right forewarning. All right. My turn, he said, as he prepared to jump at them. 2 months later, 3 months since the formation of Team 4. You will cease this illogical sidelining, an elder from the side spoke up. This was his first time in a meeting like this, and now he found that he did not enjoy it at all. Especially considering how he had been summoned with no warning while in the middle of a training session. He'd just been forced to contend with a unique chain of earth and water release jutsu from his own Senju genius. Taught by the man sitting at the center, undoubtedly. I will not send the team on any missions until I am satisfied with their ability to work together, he said, feeling like a broken record as he was forced to reiterate his points over and over again. And yet, the Umbu have seen them execute tactical formations and arrangements as a unit, and other elders spoke out. It was clear that the Hokage did not want to be seen unnecessarily interfering with the activities of the team that contained his heir, and was allowing the Council of Clan heads to bring up the concerns instead. Yes, they have. But almost always unknowingly. Both standouts of the team, Hashirama Senju and Yuzum Uchiha, are uninterested in cooperating with one another, and so are being directed by their third member, Takahata Toshiro, to complete attack patterns that bear similarities to existing formations. It is an impressive feat of tactical and strategic acumen, but it still fails to show the same results as true teamwork. In their first clash with a skilled enough opponent, all three of them will be taken apart and killed with little fanfare, he said, trying to impress the severity of the situation on the council. The Uchiha clan head, Yuzum's father, took a breath. That sound alone put the room on edge. He sat at the opposite end of the large table from the Hokage, and it was clear even from the feeling of his chakra that he was not a man to be underestimated. My daughter is a shinobi of the Uchiha clan. It is unacceptable that she has been held back from missions for this long. I killed my first man at the age of 7. Hokage-sama did it even younger. Team 4 must be sent out. They will learn to work together, or they will die. Tsukumo did not flinch at the word said, even though the fact that the girl's own father would display such a callous attitude did take him aback. He buried the instinctive flash back to his upbringing. No. Konoha would be different. It had to be. She is a shinobi of Konohagakure, you mean, the Hokage said, pinning the Uchiha clan head to his seat with a stare until the proud man conceded the point with a nod. Beyond that, I agree with your words. My brother created this village so that children would not be forced to die in senseless war, but these are not children. They are shinobi. Blade over heart. They will overcome their foolish and childish rivalries in the fires of conflict. Team 4 will leave for its first mission tomorrow. He wanted to object. To argue. They weren't ready. Not for the kind of missions he took, at least. But he was a loyal ninja, and his Kage had spoken. Yes, Hokage-sama. Dismissed. Hashirama Senju. Gather the chakra, spin it to create rotation, add density to create power, and then contain it all in a stable shell. The Rasengan that formed in his palm was perfect. Of course it was. He'd invented the jutsu while still in the academy. He never got the chance to even consider hiding the discovery, or his training. Chakra training was dangerous, and the heir to the Senju clan wasn't even allowed to dream of training on his own without some sort of supervision. Even worse, his supervision ended up being a member of the Hyuga clan more often than not, and if you managed to hide anything from the Byakugan, then you need an award of some sort. He'd decided that it was better to just come clean with it, and practice it in plain sight. That also meant that he had to engineer a lot of unnecessary trial and error into the jutsu creation project, but that had ended up being for the best. He probably understood the Rasengan better than everyone not named Minato Namikaze. Considering he hadn't even joined the academy yet, Hashirama was the uncontested master of all things Rasengan. It was worth it because the sphere in his hand began to shift in shape, blades shooting out from the edges as he manipulated the shape and form of the jutsu. He lifted it above his head as it took the form of a spinning shuriken the size of a windmill shuriken above his head. No wind release, yet. But he'd been able to prove his theory that the Rasengan could be made throwable as a pure shape transformation technique. Anything else would be subordinate. It also meant that he was one step closer to completing Project Quincy. He tossed the technique into the mini forest that he trained in, and it mowed through a few trees before it lost its consistency and disappeared. It would kill a man just as good as any technique, but it did lack a lot of the more explosive properties of a proper wind release, Rasen Shuriken. So what are you going to call that one, young master? He heard the voice from behind him, and he forced a smile on his face before he turned to look at the Hyuga branch member that had been sent to follow him today. The same person that was sent with him on most days, he knew. If only he could ever manage to remember the man's name. He was certain he'd never been told, but also not completely certain. It wasn't impossible that he'd forgotten the man's name. It would also be highly embarrassing if he asked and found that he'd already been told. Rasen Shuriken, Hyuga-san, he said, not for the first time being thankful for how much the Hyuga clan remained sticklers for traditions and old-fashioned etiquette. A fitting name, young master, the man replied, and it was all Shari could do not to gag at the blatant arse-kissing. Sure, he knew that that was probably the man's nature. That didn't stop him from feeling awkward whenever the man began going on and on about how skilled Shori was, or how much of a prodigy his superior Hyuga genes made him. The man seemed intent on ignoring Shori's conspicuously brown eyes and their very noticeable pupils. He'd been tested multiple times across his childhood, and everyone had finally been forced to accept that he would never get the Byakugan after he turned 8. Thank you? But we have to leave. I have a mission to get ready for, after all, he said, and began making his way back to the clan compound. Perhaps his teammates had failed to see it, but he was certain that there was something else behind their sensei's sudden switch in tactics. Everything he'd seen from Hitaki Tsukumo so far had told him that the man was not the type to give up merely because something was hard. He made the decision not to go on any missions with them until they mastered teamwork, and Hashirama was certain that he would live up to the threat. Hashirama had even banked on it. Constant sparring sessions against an opponent far above his level had taken his skills to new heights at speeds that felt frankly unfair. He'd have got a big head about how much progress he was making if he couldn't see that Toshiro was gaining just as much, and that Uchiha Yuzum and her cheating eyes were learning even faster than he was. She'd already used a few of Hashirama's own jutsu against their sensei, and while he wasn't offended since he hadn't invented those jutsu himself, he was a bit peeved at her progress outstripping his. Only the fact that the original gap between them had been so large had kept him still ahead of her. Hopefully, the equalizers he was working on would be enough to widen the gap when necessary and ensure he was ready for what he knew would come in 10 years. Yes, young master. I have taken the liberty in ensuring that your equipment would be packed and prepared, he said. And my bow? It is assumed that young master would not intend in taking the instrument with him on a mission outside the village's walls. Shori smiled wryly. Please have it included. It is a key piece of equipment, after all. I'd hate to not have it, and need it, he replied. He'd found it funny how virtually every adult shinobi tried to get him to give up on the bow. It was his bit of rebellion against the establishment. And bows were cool AF. Toshiro Takahata 9 years until the outbreak of the Second Great Shinobi War. Don't forget the plan, their sensei said, and then disappeared. He resisted the urge to gulp. How could he ever forget the plan? It was his plan, after all. They stood in the tree watching the bandit encampment through Fuinjutsu-enhanced binoculars. Having a Senju on the team was such a hack. They got the best stuff. His mother even said that these binoculars weren't cleared for issue to Jounin yet. And yet, Hashirama had just fished out 4 of them from the bag like it was nothing. It probably was. Toshiro had seen the kind of ballpark Senju wealth existed in. I trust you, his friend said, and then clapped him on the shoulder. It was a classic example of bad intelligence. On their 7th mission in as many months, they'd been sent to root out and destroy a bandit camp. He noticed a theme. Unlike virtually every other team in their graduating class, they'd only been sent on one type of mission. The kind where direct combat was probable. Nay, it was expected. They were expected to seek out opponents and fight them. His best guess was that the administrative arm of the village thought his team wouldn't be good for much else. He couldn't disagree, he thought, looking at his teammates. Yuzum had fished out a gunbai of all weapons a few months ago, and now she was giving the gigantic and unusual weapon a few anticipatory swings. She was deadly with the thing, he knew. Shori already had an easy smile on his face. The kind of smile that was a harbinger of mischief. That was what he was taking advantage of with this plan, Shori's natural skill at deception. Like he could sense his thoughts, Shori smiled at him and then dropped out of the tree they'd been standing in. As he landed, his appearance shifted with an application of chakra so precise that the telltale puff of smoke that marked the transformation jutsu was nowhere to be found. A medical ninja for a cousin meant Shori had the best chakra control of them all. Even better than sensei if the man was to be believed. Toshiro had since learned that Tsukumo Hatake rarely ever spoke the truth. And in the few instances he did, there was always an extra layer of subtext only available to those who bothered to look underneath the underneath. Shori's gait shifted, becoming more panicked and hurried. He always found it fascinating just how many messages humans could pass with nothing but body language. It fascinated him, but people like Shori and Kizuru, they obsessed over it. Years ago, he'd found it quirky how they played games where they took on different personas and kept poking at each other to get the other to break character. Now, he could see how useful that had become. Observant as he thought himself to be, he couldn't see a single sign that Shori was anything more than what he presented himself as. A scared child running into a group of bandits, unknowing of the fate that awaited him. Help, help, he shouted, voice sounding higher pitched than usual, and also much louder than the whisper he preferred these days. Wind release training had a habit of straining the vocal cords, he'd explained. Toshiro looked to his side and noted Yuzum watching everything with her bright red eyes. 10 months as a genin had between training with a jounin and missions where combat was guaranteed developed her Sharingan to the perfect state. 3 tomo in each eye. His reading told him that most Uchiha didn't get to that level until they were well into adulthood. Yuzum was just 11. They all were. Hey. It's a kid, one of the bandits said, looking down from the wall of the encampment they occupied to get a good look at Shori. Encampment was a hell of an understatement. Somehow, the bandits had managed to find and take possession of an old fortress from the Warring States period that had been abandoned by the clan after they'd moved to Konoha. He couldn't quite tell which clan it had been, but he would make sure to ask Hashirama after they'd taken the place. What do you want, kid? Another asked as Shori kept shouting for help. And my fat father. He's in true trouble with those tears? Shori's commitment to the act was commendable. The bandits on the wall wasted no time in dropping their guards. What happened? One asked. RCA caravan. A wheel broke, and when Dad was trying to fix it, his leg. It br bro, he collapsed into further tears. Please help us, he finally screamed out through the tears. Toshiro knew that if he could look at the bandits' eyes, there'd be real signs floating in them. Free money. They were unlikely to say no. They were also very likely to do the stupid thing and abandon their posts at the gate without waking up the others. They'd be keen on keeping as much of the loot for themselves as possible. Their intel said that the leader of this particular group was a greedy man who did little if any sharing of the loot with the subordinates. His gamble paid off as the men whispered to themselves before one of them spoke, "We'll help you, kid. Stop crying. Just take us to the caravan." Toshiro's heart skipped a beat as it seemed like only half of them were going to follow Shori. But after a short argument, the half that had been supposed to wait behind joined in with the half that were going to follow Shori. All 13 of them trooped out of the gate, greedy smiles on their faces and weapons clutched in their hands. "Take us there," Gaki, one of them said in the kind of tone that made Toshiro itch to put a kunai through his head. Shori did his job and began to lead them away, making him release a breath he hadn't even known that he'd been holding. "Okay, it's our time to shine," he whispered at his teammate. She did nothing but grunt at him, but it was a meaningful improvement. At least, she no longer just blatantly ignored him and his plans. He hated how she acted like he was beneath her, but that was a matter for another day. They flew through the tree line at top speed, jumping into Thu Fortress at opposite ends. He had faith in her to carry out her path. The only genin more skilled than Yuzum was Shori, and he was incomparable to anyone else. He weaved seals, spreading a genjutsu through his part of the building. Shori had taught him this one from the Senju library. It did nothing but make the victims fall asleep. It was more useful than most others because it wasn't designed to affect only a single target like most other genjutsu. It was area of effect. That made it slightly weaker than if it had been used against only a single target, but they were civilian bandits, with no ninja training. They had virtually no genjutsu resistance. He felt the genjutsu take hold, and he began to make his way from room to room, careful to step on only the balls of his foot. The first room was empty. The first 4 he checked were empty. It was only in the 5th room that he found a single bandit sleeping. His snores bounced against the walls of the room. Toshiro made sure to creep silently, and applied some chakra to his feet to ensure that the room remained silent. He leaned over the man on the futon, and closed his eyes to steel himself. Blade over heart. His lunatic flashed for a second as he sliced through the carotid artery as he'd been taught. He stood up after being sure the man was dead and moved on to the next room. It was a butcher's job, what he did. But he was a shinobi. These men threatened the people of Konoha. His mother. He had to fulfill his duty. Part of him wondered if Shori and Yuzum ever had second thoughts about things like this. He forced himself to stifle the chuckle. The idea was ludicrous. They'd been raised to be shinobi from the day their lives began. Things like this would be easy for them. He walked further into the fortress. 6. He'd eliminated 6 people so far. That meant that there were closer to 9 people on Yuzum's half of the fortress. He opened the last room and almost stepped backwards at seeing 2 men in this room. Unlike the others, they were naked. He blocked the thoughts that rose in his mind. He knew what sex was. It wasn't surprising that 2 men in a stressful situation would lean on each other. He walked inside the room and made his decision to do his job. Both men were so entwined that it was difficult to get at one's neck. It was fine. He eliminated the first with a slice along the carotid like routine. With the second, he rolled his body over, and somehow he managed to break out of the genjutsu. On seeing the shinobi over him, the man let loose an impressive scream. Toshiro stabbed his kunai through the man's open mouth and into his brain, silencing him. He just hoped that the noise hadn't ruined Yuzum's part in the mission. He opened the door and was met with the Uchiha girl wiping off blood from her gunbai. It wasn't the blunt instrument he'd expected on the first time he'd seen it. The edges were deceptively sharp. "That was sloppy," she commented with a scoff. "I didn't ask for your opinion," he replied tersely. "Are you done with your end of the fortress?" he asked her. "Yes, I am. Now we head to the leader of this mostly crew," she said, and he nodded. He was almost surprised that she'd made the effort to wait for him before moving ahead. It was the plan, but he was proud that she'd stuck to it. They moved up the stairs as one unit, walking in step. Both their steps were silent, and when they finally arrived at the door, it was to find it open. Yuzum pushed it inwards, and it moved with no resistance. They found their target sitting on a wooden chair, waiting for them. It was shaped like a throne, all things considered. Given this was the great hall of the fortress, it wasn't much a surprise. "So it was Konoha. My bet would have been on IWA," he said, looking at them with a smile on his face. The darkness parted to reveal a tall man. Taller than Sensei. With long black hair and a ponytail and coal-black eyes. I've let you kill those useless fools with no resistance. I gain nothing in killing children. Turn around and count yourselves lucky, he said, not even standing to address them. It took a second for Yuzum to cross the distance between them. Her gunbai cut through the throne as their target bent downwards to dodge out of the way of the attack. His hands slammed against the ground, and Toshiro was sure that it was only months of sparring with Shori that gave her the instinct to retreat. Where she previously stood was a single spike of gleaming stone. She weaved through seals of her own, but her fireball was denied by a massive wall of stone with a snarling tiger imprinted on it. Toshiro weaved seals and reached for their opponent's chakra network with his genjutsu. It took hold for only a second before snapping. The wall in front of them shifted, having spikes form along its surface. To deter them from climbing, maybe? His deduction was disproven. Dodge, he screamed as the wall came apart, and the spikes were sent hurtling at them. He dove to the side while he heard Yuzum do the same on the other side. I won't give you another chance to retreat. Yuzum scoffed across from him, and he almost chuckled at her reaction. Retreat? They were shinobi of Kanehigakure. They did not retreat. Besides, they had the upper hand here. He just didn't know it yet. Yuzum weaved 5 seals and he jumped pet backwards. He knew what was coming. Katon, Hozenka no Jutsu, she said, executing her own unique flavor of the phoenix flower jutsu. She spewed out several missiles of flame that fanned out in a wide angle, spreading across the hall before converging in on a single target. Their opponent. His hands remained on the ground, and instead of a single wall, a giant dome of earth formed, surrounding him from all angles. The flame's attacks hit the dome and exploded. The smoke parted to reveal that the stone was unharmed. A few scuff marks were all that could be shown from the attack. Before the smoke had completely parted, a single blur dropped from the ceiling. Shori landed on the dome. He wanted to shout out a warning that the guy could manipulate the dome from the inside, but that was moot point as Shori placed his hands on the dome and Visible exerted his massive reserves to do something. He dropped from the dome with a chuckle. I didn't think that would work so easily, he said, looking at both of them, with a smile on his face. What did you do? Yuzum asked, asking the question on both their minds. The dome fell apart behind him, revealing their opponent with several holes through his body. The body fell to the ground, limp, without the dome holding it up. The same thing he did with the earth wall he hit you guys with. I figured that if I overpowered the chakra he had in the jutsu, then I could manipulate his jutsu like it was mine instead. Bastard never even saw it coming, he said with an easy smile on his face. You stole my kill, was Yuzum's reply as she released a grunt. Suddenly, the ground beneath Shari fell in as he was buried up to his neck. Their opponent appeared right above him with a hammer in his hand. Toshiro felt himself frozen in place. Yuzum was in motion. Everyone looked like they were moving through jello. Each step Yuzum took was slow. Too slow. The hammer arced down, aimed right for Shori's head. And then everything snapped back into reality. Their opponent's body was pinned to the wall. Sensei stood in front of him with both hands on the hilt of his chakra saber. The same saber that was doing the job of pinning their opponent to the wall. What did I say about dropping your guard? He was shouting at Shori. He'd never heard Sensei shout before. Never even seen any of the irritation that they'd caused him on his face. Now? He looked apoplectic. His normally flaccid, easygoing expression was nowhere to be found. He looked in Azura from Naraka itself. And Shori was the subject of all that attention. I'm sorry, Sensei. I really thought I'd got him. That's one hell of a clone jutsu, he said, trying to change the subject with the smoothness that came so naturally to him, but their sensei was having none of it today. So we've been genin for a year now. Izuku was the one who spoke. The rest of the gathering were spread out across the Senju lawn like usual. These gatherings had become monthly things instead of weekly engagements, but Toshiro was impressed with the effort Shori made to keep up with his friends. After graduation, the circle had widened to include everyone in their graduating class. Some people came more often than others, but even Yuzum could be found calmly drinking a cup of tomato juice in a quiet corner of her own. Yes, we have, Shori said. Did your sensei tell you about the thing? Kizuru was the one who asked now, in a whisper that had no chance of going unnoticed by the entire gathering. I'm willing to bet all our sensei did, Shori replied, not bothering with the whisper. I assume the thing you speak of is the exhibition to take place in the village next month, Yuram said with her customary formal tone and low-pitched voice. He'd have mistaken her for a boy, with how deep her voice could get every so often. Of course, those thoughts were never expressed. Stupid thoughts were best left in the head before they infected the air. Yes, it is, Kizuru said, not even turning to her. He kept his attention on Shori, who was moving around Choni as the larger boy worked on the grill. Shori hadn't given up on figuring out how the Akimichi pulled off their food-related sorcery, and Choni was amused enough to let him observe the whole process every single time. 9 months of effort had yielded nothing so far, as Shori's food was always found wanting. "What do you think about it, Shori?" Omoikane asked, putting words to the question his teammate was obviously itching to ask. "I think it's going to be fun. Just imagine how much we'll learn from fighting against shinobi from Kumo and Kusa, and even Taki. There's going to be a lot of foreign shinobi here for us to learn from," he said. No one said anything about fighting, Shikaheim pointed out with narrowed eyes, but Shori just waved her point away. "We're shinobi. The only thing we can do that will entertain the civilians is fight. Considering the size of the stadium being built for this, I'm willing to bet that Uncle is expecting a massive audience. Wouldn't do to bore them all, would it?" he said with his trademark smile and winked at her. "Is it even safe to have so many foreigners in the village all at once?" Inokan asked, flipping his long ponytail to get some hair out of his bright blue eyes. "It has to be. Hokage-sama has been working on this for a while. Besides, the war ended over a decade ago. The shinobi nations are at peace. This kind of thing is just supposed to be more cooperation to help strengthen that peace. This exhibition is going to be a substitute for war, that's what my uncle said. If we children fight it out, then the adults won't have to," was Omoikane's response. He spoke with the tone of someone repeating something he'd been told, but Toshiro found no reason to disagree with him. None of the other villages would be bold enough to attack them here. They'd be surrounded and cut down. The sizzling of the meat on the grill was the only sound to be heard for a while until Shari sighed in disappointment and went to pick up his bow. China's chuckles followed his path. The genin exhibitions were the talk of the town for the month until the day they arrived. Everything in Konoha was turned up to 11 as everyone tried to put their best foot forward to prepare for the visiting villages. Even my Hyuga cousins had not been left out of the excitement. Visiting the compound to pick up a scroll on Tenet's control showed me that they were already working on painting the entire thing again. Insane. Especially considering they did a repaint every 2 years, and the last hadn't even been up to a year ago. It went to show just how seriously everyone was taking this. I couldn't judge them. Was I not much the same? My ninjutsu and taijutsu were polished to perfection. The seals I'd held off on implementing into my arrows until I was more than good enough to do them myself were completed post-haste. They were unable to do everything I wanted, but they could do enough. The major remaining project was a seal for the bow itself. A seal that would turn it from an exceptionally well-crafted bow to a ninja weapon on the level of the Swords of the Mist, or even the Raijin no Ken. Speaking of the Raijin no Ken, Uncle had even been kind enough to allow me to study the weapon. A marked change after months of holding back and insisting that if I wanted to build anything similar, I should design the matrix on my own. It was clear that the pressure of the exhibition was getting to even him. At the very least it was making him much more helpful than usual. On the other hand, Hataki Tsukumo seemed to have decided that he didn't give a rat's arse about what was coming or when he was coming. He'd done his duty of notifying us that it was happening and that we'd automatically been registered by the Hokage's own recommendation, and went back to business as usual. We'd already taken our mission for the month, so that meant we spent our time training now. "Sensei, can you help me with this?" I heard Yuzum's voice from the other end of the clearing and chuckled. She'd caught the bug like nothing else. All her training was geared to winning the exhibition in whatever way she could. Already bored with my last, I leaned away from the scroll I was bent over and turned my attention to her. Her fist crackled with lightning-natured chakra as she attempted to channel it into her gun by, of all things, but the wood just seemed to accept the chakra and do nothing with it. Chakra flow. Interesting technique. I dabbled with it a bit for my arrows after remembering what Killer Bee could do with a pencil and lightning release in the anime. Unfortunately, it seemed that either wind release worked differently, or there was something I was missing. The chakra flowing into the arrows cut out almost immediately. I fired them from my bow. Good for an initial boost in speed, but nothing more. It was the whole reason I wanted to study the Raijin no Ken. Maybe if I could channel lightning-natured chakra instead, then it would work better. So far, there had been no luck with deciphering my uncle's sealing technique, but I had hoped that it would come together sooner rather than later. On the other end of the clearing, Toshiro balanced upside down on the stream with a single finger as he sought to sharpen his chakra control to a knife's edge. It would improve his genjutsu definitely, but I wasn't sure that was the best use of his time. To be completely honest, I wasn't the biggest fan of genjutsu as an art. Sure, it was powerful now, but I knew what was coming. Otsutsuki did not fall for genjutsu. That was why every spare minute not shoved into fuinjutsu practice was spent working on my taijutsu. I had to make sure it was the one skill I never neglected. But that was beside the point. I turned to the clone beside me and noted that he was weaving seals almost non-stop. That was another thing that came with the upcoming exhibition. The Shadow Clone Jutsu. I was already using it as a training aid, and it had doubled the speed at which I could work on certain skills. One clone worked on ninjutsu in the training ground, Another clone worked on Fuinjutsu with grandmother back at home, and I spent all my time either doing physical training and taijutsu or trying to puzzle out new jutsu in my mind. The former was because it was the only thing I couldn't get a clone to do for me, and the latter because it was one aspect of ninja training that I legitimately enjoyed. Presently, the scroll on chakra control through every tenketsu was proving to be less helpful than expected. That was generous. It was mostly useless to me. It wasn't the fault of anyone in particular, however. Who could have foreseen someone born with one of the Hyuga Kekkei Genkai but not the other? Definitely not the author of this particular scroll. He placed a lot of emphasis on using the Byakugan to monitor the flow of chakra through the tenketsu. The Byakugan that I didn't quite have. Fun times were ahead of me. Especially since I couldn't see any other way to figure out Kakuzu's Doma before the exams. Maybe focus on something else for the moment, and come back with a fresh head. A voice said from my side, leaning over the scroll. I hastily snapped it shut and turned to the intruder with a scowl. My eyes met my sensei's and I just sighed before standing up. He was right. I'd gained nothing from banging my head against the problem over and over again. Taijutsu spar? I asked him, trying to work out some of my frustrations, and he answered with a snap kick to my head that I barely moved out of the way of. Perhaps this had been a better idea than he'd given the higher-ups credit for. A massive stadium on the outskirts of the village. He would probably throw up if he got to see the bill that this thing had taken. But each seat had sold for tens of thousands of yen. Each seat was filled now. Tickets had sold so quickly that civilians who wanted to attend had been forced to buy them for even higher prices from resellers. Scalpers, Hashirama, referred to them as. Of course, he had a name for them. He was one of them. His student had made about 500,000 yen from scalping. Of course, the Hokage had made him return the money once he found out about it. Word on the street was that his killing intent could have been felt for miles beyond the Senju compound when he found out. But that only went to show how much demand had existed for something like this. Genin from all 5 of the major villages and several minor ones stood in the middle of the field, being stared at and pointed out by the spectators. As a Jounin sensei, he'd received a free ticket to sit among the spectators, and here he could get a real pulse for what was being felt. Firstly, the more physically distinctive a shinobi was, the more attention they received. That meant that most of the attention was going to Konoha Genin, even from the merchants that hailed from other villages. But for every rule, there was an exception. Hashirama with his dark hair and eyes drew more attention than any other. Perhaps it was the choice of outfit. He'd almost facebound once he first saw it. The boy had a death wish, and he seemed intent on committing suicide by enemy shinobi. There was no chance that his chosen armor had been coincidental. Old-fashioned Senju armor from the Warring States period in the same blood red his grandfather had favored. It looked comical on his 12-year-old frame, but it was clear that he would grow into it in time. The giant scroll on his back did even more to highlight just where he had taken his inspiration from. His face was sharper, more noble in appearance, and his body was more lithe, but for all anyone could see at first glance, he was Hashirama writ small. And almost as if not to be outdone, his teammate had decided to don a similar outfit. The gunbai strapped to her back did her no favors in denying the resemblance. Stood next to each other as they were, he'd heard more than one foreign shinobi whisper, Hashirama and Madara, on catching sight of the both of them. The fact that the duo had never fought in the first great shinobi war had done little to lessen their foreign renown. And now, for better or for worse, his students were going to be regarded as the second coming of Konoha's legendary founding duo. Ladies and gentlemen in attendance. A voice rang across the arena. A familiar voice. Jiraiya, he placed it, once he had a look at the commentator's box. Jiraiya stood there with his customary wide smile, next to a wizened old man. The armor he wore marked him as a samurai of Tetsu no Kuni. He could see the strategy. Jiraiya was there to provide commentary biased towards Konoha, while the samurai offered a neutral counterpoint. It was clearly an overture to keep the guests from taking offense. The Hokage had truly thought of everything. And Tsukumo knew that even with the samurai being a counterparty, the civilians would still be more swayed by Jiraiya's words. His boisterous voice and charming tone had that ability. Welcome to the first ever Great Genin exhibition. We have shinobi from all the best villages, and even IWA here with us. The last part of the sentence received jeers from one section of the crowd, but they all took it with good humor as intended. Tsukumo's eyes searched through the genin, counting the numbers that came from each village with a discerning eye. 3 tasks. With each task taking place in this very arena. Each task will be a surprise for our dear lovely genin taking part in this exhibition, so you can be sure to see the adaptability and genius of our genuine and full display, he said, getting murmurs from the crowd as they anxiously waited for the commencement of the tasks. The murmurs turned into gasps of surprise as 2 massive screens were unveiled at each end of the arena. Konoha's Sealing Core has crafted a device to ensure that you get to view every second of action from the comfort of your seats without straining your necks. Through groundbreaking algorithms and self-matrices that hurt my head to think of, these screens are going to use small receptors following each team to ensure that we get to see what they're all up to. His words excited the civilians, but the shinobi began to whisper quietly. Sakumo resisted the urge to smile. Whatever plans the foreigners had were going to be thoroughly derailed by the fact that they'd have eyes on their genin for every step of the process. His fear that this would be used as an opportunity to kill off Konoha's genin in a series of accidents was thoroughly quelled. No shinobi worth their salt would do something so underhanded in front of civilians. One way or another, they all went to the effort of pretending to be upstanding and honorable fellows to their civilian clientele. Small devices, golden with wings that moved as quickly as a hummingbird's, flew across the arena, attaching themselves to each genin team. Like magic, the screens came to life, showing the smiling or scowling or doing nothing at all faces of the various genin. Hashirama waved at his device and his team's screen grew to cover most of the screen, with the smaller screens being relegated to the side. Of course, the view will shift over time to give you the best view of the most action, Jiraiya said. An impressive device, his taciturn samurai companion commented. Indeed. Konoha's Sealing team is one of the best in the world, after all. Moving on to the first task, my companion, Lord Yoramusha of Tetsu no Kuni, will introduce the first test. The first task is a maze. In a few seconds, the maze will form, covering most of the arena. Around the maze will be clues that you must solve to know the right route to follow. All wrong routes are trapped to high heaven. Only the correct route will be free from traps. The first 15 teams to make it out of the maze will make it to the next stage. He delivered his words with a sharp tone that amplified their impact. Even the genin began to worriedly whisper to themselves. Of course, any combat is prohibited within the maze. The use of ninjutsu to destroy or affect the maze in any way is also prohibited. Either of which will get you disqualified immediately. We're watching at that, he cut off. Then, the ground around the platform the genin stood on began to vibrate. All around them, walls began to rise from the ground. The civilians gasped at watching the maze form before their eyes. Sakumo knew that it must have been the work of dozens of Earth Release Masters working in concert towards a single goal. But even that, it was impressive that the maze was being formed in real time. Noticing the pattern in which the maze rose, he changed that impression. The maze had already been formed. It was probably built and kept underground. Now, they just had to lift it back up. Not a small task by any means, but still less impressive than building a new maze from scratch. Above each entrance to the maze lies a number. There are 90 entrances for the 90 teams enrolled in the exams. Move to the one that matches your registration number. His team moved to the 47th entrance as he watched Hashirama trade barbs with his Uchiha friend, Yuzume's cousin, before the boy left to join his team. Those two were more suited to the Hashirama and Madara comparisons. Hashirama and Yuzume could scarcely spend an hour in each other's presence before starting up a fight. Now begin, Jiraiya's voice sounded out, and each team ran in. He turned to the screen to get a view of his team. The maze was covered from the top, probably to prevent any genius from deciding to jump over the whole thing. Senju Hashirama. He'd known about the screens ahead of time. He'd even come up with the idea to model the receptors after golden snitches. Tobirama had given the assignment to grandmother some months ago, and when she struggled to find a good form factor for the receptor devices, I'd drawn her a diagram of a golden snitch, and the rest was history. It was perfect. Their spherical bodies meant that they could contain a surprisingly long fuinjutsu script both within and outside their bodies. The matrix itself was a work of art on the level of the great weapons out there. Certainly, more complex than the Raijin no Ken. The power to attack itself to a genin's chakra signature, to power wings and follow said genin around, to power visual receptors that functioned on the same wavelength as the human eye, and then to transmit everything to the screens. Comparatively, the screens were simple. More complicated than anything he could make, but still simpler than the receptors. The screens took data from the receptors and displayed it. That wasn't hard. The hard part was designing a matrix that would decide which feed was the most interesting and magnifying that while relegating the rest to a smaller view. It functioned a bit like the computers he knew in his previous life. He'd always thought that fuinjutsu was a plot-like programming, and the matrix behind the screens was the clearest example of that similarity. It was trained on a few signs of what would make good content, and it was trained to prioritize them based on a fixed list, but also taught that when two scenes were equally interesting, it would prioritize the one with a visible Konoha headband. When both had that, it would basically flip a coin and randomly decide. The horn went off and both he and his teammates walked into the maze. He noted that it was covered from the outside world with an impressive level of isolations. The screams of the crowd had died out as they walked in. Even the light from outside did not reach them in the labyrinth. Instead, it was lit by strange crystals in the walls. Their first obstacle was the fact that there were two paths waiting for them after they walked in. Toshiro began rifling through his pockets for a notepad, most likely to decode the obvious cryptograph. Yuzum had walked forward to look into each path with her Sharingan, probably trying to tell which route was trapped with her enhanced eyesight. He let out a fake cough to get their attention. This test will be easy. Easy for me, at least he bragged. He knew he was bragging as he squatted down and placed his palm on the ground. The rules said they weren't allowed to use ninjutsu to affect the walls in any way. They said nothing about using chakra to feel them out. "What are you doing?" Toshiro asked. "This entire maze was made with ninjutsu, so it'll be a bit harder, but one of the more advanced applications of Earth-Nature affinity training is the ability to sense earthen formations. I'm using that skill to build a map of the maze in my head and find which route led to the exit," he said to them. "So this test will favor IWA Shinobi?" Yuzum asked with a hand on her gunbai. Combat wasn't permitted in this test, but both of his teammates were clearly on edge. Tsukumo had instilled a healthy, or unhealthy, depending on whom you asked, level of paranoia in them. This skill is something most Chunin won't even be familiar with. If it favors any IWA genin, then they'd be a prodigy who wouldn't have had any difficulty with the test, regardless of what it was, he replied, assuaging her concerns that their home village had chosen to pander to another. "Got it," he said. "Follow me," he then said to the both of them, getting an affirmative response from Toshiro and a begrudging nod from Yuzum as he stared at her until she replied. Her usual bullshit wasn't going to be accepted here. She'd got better, for sure. A year of being in the same team with them and training with them meant that a lot of the original aggressiveness had died out quickly. She wasn't what he'd describe as a friend, but they were definitely on the level of friendly acquaintances. With Toshiro, she'd spun up a more genuine friendship than the working relationship they shared. He couldn't have cared less, with not having the time or patience for what he saw as self-entitled bullshit. They followed his mental map to a T. Even as they heard traps going off across the maze, nothing affected them as they moved through the completely untrapped route. Another thing he noted as he plotted out the map of the maze was that all the trapped routes did eventually lead to exits, but they were so circuitous that it would take at least thrice the time to cover those routes. A determined and skilled enough shinobi could do it, but it wouldn't be easy. He figured that this test would probably be the one that got him the least attention, almost in direct opposition to the orders he'd received to show the world that Konoha's next generation as strong as their predecessors and warn off the other villages from considering war, but he figured finishing this test first would go a long way in projecting that image. Not as long a way as walking through all the traps like some inevitable and indomitable god, but that would be stupid. His job wasn't to show that Konoha shinobi had more strength than wits. Probably the opposite, as he thought of it. They came across a section of the maze with 5 paths and a riddle scrawled atop it. Reading the riddle, he cracked a smile. "I speak without a mouth and hear without ears. I have no body, but I come alive with the wind. What am I?" He loved riddles. They walked into the 4th path, and he noted that every step they took audibly echoed to their ears. Echo. That was the answer to the riddle. He could just imagine how much time another team would have had to spend on getting through a challenge like that. He looked at the surrounding walls. What others would have mistaken for scratches, he correctly identified as a sealing matrix. A familiar sealing matrix. The same one his mother's clan used for their personal rooms to prevent their Byakugan wielders from getting too peaky. He turned his thoughts from his mother. He could not afford a distraction right now. They walked forwards and came face to face with another team walking in the exact opposite direction. The IWA team had 3 shinobi, a whiter boy years older who looked muscular enough to crush Toshiro's head in his grip, a lithe girl with sleeves that went past her hands and covered view of her fingers, and a third boy with auburn hair parted off to the side and a wicked smirk on his face. Both his team and theirs kept careful watch of each other as they made sure to pass each other by with as large a margin as possible. Nobody wanted to risk a fight breaking out that would get all of them tossed out of the labyrinth. When they'd finally passed each other, he made a point of not turning to watch them leave. Yuzum had more than enough paranoia for the 3 of them, as she watched them carefully with blood-red eyes until they rounded the corner. The Senju boy didn't look all that. His Uchiha teammate is much more scary. They heard a voice he suspected belonged to the red-haired boy come from the corner the IWA Nin had just rounded. Yuzum visibly preened at the unintended compliment, as he chuckled. He had no need for looking menacing or intimidating. Smaller animals puffed themselves up to look bigger and meaner than they actually were. He was no small animal. He had no need to intimidate with his appearance, he'd let his strength do that for him. The next fork in the road had 2 paths. There was a complex equation scrawled above the route that he didn't even bother reading once he saw just how many variables it had. He led his team left, and they followed. They hadn't come across a single trap. He knew Yuzum kept a watchful eye out, and that both he and Toshiro were keeping track of their surroundings in their own ways. him through earth-natured chakra, and Toshiro through his newly discovered affinity for chakra sensing. The path led to another path that led to a massive room with doors on every side. The puzzle was etched into the ground. He smiled and went to a path a few paths away from the one that they'd come in through. As they walked through, he noted another team come out from another one of the paths. A team in traditional cloud attire. The only one in the team that caught his attention was a boy even younger than they were with long bicolored hair, half green, half white. It was notable enough that he was sure he'd seen that particular combination in the anime before. The path they walked through led to another intersection, and that led to another, until they finally quite literally saw the light at the end of the tunnel. He slowed down to draw a seal near the exit as a bit of a gift for whoever came after them. The labyrinth had been lit with luminous crystals, but that did not compare with the sunlight that beamed in from outside. He walked out of the labyrinth first to roars from the crowd. "Smile and wave, boys," he said to his teammates, with a bright smile on his face. The first team to complete the first test is Team 47 from Konoha. Senju Hashirama, Uchiha Yuzum, and Takahata Toshiro. Jiraiya's familiar voice rang across the stadium. When he saw Shori stop to scrawl down that seal, he'd known that there was nothing good that would come of it. At least, they were done with the exam. He was proven right when the next team to approach the final tunnel stepped over the seal. It was only Shikahime's observant nature that allowed her to notice the glow on the floor before the seal went off. She activated her shadow jutsu and somehow used it to toss both her teammates out of the tunnel while she sank into the ground. She surfaced outside the tunnel a few seconds later, but no one had any attention to give her. All the attention was on the destroyed exit. Shori's seal had caused the tunnel to implode in on itself, so everyone within the mail was essentially sealed within by the stone that made up the path. Rather, all the attention flickered between the exit and Shori's brightly smiling face. He wanted to shrink in on itself as the screen magnified their own feed. His skin looked pasty white on the large display. It was clear that he wanted to be anywhere but here. Yuzum glowered right at the receptor. Her glare shot from the screen in a way that showed her clear disdain for everyone watching. Shori, on the other hand, smiled and waved. He was smiling. A bright smile that made it clear he wasn't concerned with the shouts of him being a cheater that came from certain parts of the crowd. Toshiro was beginning to fear that the field would be overrun by pissed off spectators when the commentator's voice rang out. A brilliant tactic from the Konoha team. Sealing up the entrance to prevent others from making their way through easily, the samurai said with an approving hum, making it clear that nothing Shori had done was against the rules. Even better, he used Fuinjutsu, which was never mentioned in the rules, and waited until he was more than done with the exam before allowing his trap to take effect. A brilliant tactic, indeed. But let us not hesitate to give it up for the second team to pass this stage, Team 66 from Konoha, Yamanaka Inoken, Naro Shikahime, and Akimichi Choni. Jiraiya's words put paid to the whispers as everyone moved to applauding Shikahime's team. Even better, the screen decided to show a replay of them escaping the trap. At the end of the day, it took an hour for someone to finally complete the maze again. It was the team they passed from IWA. They made it to the sealed exit, like multiple other teams had. But instead of taking it as a dead end like the other teams had, the muscular one moved forward to examine the site of the cave-in. He exchanged words with his teammates, and then they walked backwards before the one with red hair made a single hand seal the tiger seal. Instead of a fireball, he breathed out multiple small balls of lava. They slammed into the cave-in and shot through. The blockage on the exit was lifted, and they walked through. The fourth team to pass was Izuku's. Only the fourth by a technicality because it seems they had run into Uram's team at some point in the maze, and then chosen to work together to complete the rest of it. Uram stepped backwards to allow Izuku step through first. Toshiro noted that all four of the genin teams to have graduated with him had been in the top 5. The next team had the boy with bicolored hair that Shori had been staring at for a while. He noticed him watching their feed even before they got to the exit. Subsequently, teams started to pass through at a steady rate. All in all, the first stage had taken close to 3 hours from start to end. Shori's prank had definitely lengthened the task beyond all expectations. Now that we have our first 14 teams, we can end the task, Jiraiya's voice rang out before the max began to open up. Those still within it were visibly disappointed to find that they had lost and been disqualified. In one fell swoop, they'd gone from hundreds to 14 genin teams. I hope you all got your fill of the Kamer task. From now, we'll be diving right into the action, Jiraiya said, and the ground began to vibrate again. All the genin who passed had been returned to the central platform, while everyone else was made to evacuate the field. Toshiro noted that apart from his genin class, one other team had passed from Konoha. One team each had passed from both Kumo and IWA. 2 teams had passed from Suna. Shockingly, 3 teams had passed from Kiri. 1 team had passed from the Hidden Waterfall Village, and the last 2 teams had come from the Land of Hot Water, and a land of grass respectively. All 5 major villages were represented, but Konoha had the majority. He watched as the field shifted. 2 hills began to rise from the surrounding earth with flags on them, one red and one green. For the second task, we have a new game to play. This one involving all 14 teams in plain view of you, the viewing audience. It's called King of the Flags. As you can see, there are 2 hills and 2 flags in the playfield. Your task is simple. Every team is to work on their own to complete one of 2 objectives, either take the hill or take the flag. Taking the hill means having the only people on the peak of the hill be members of one's team. For every 30 seconds that a team holds the hill, they get 20 points. If the hill is in contention, meaning that the people on the hill are members of more than one team, then the points are shared between the teams equally. As for the flags, the rule involving the flags is simple. Taking the flag means having possession of the flag at the end of the stage. Each flag is worth 200 points. The top 5 teams at the end will move on to the final stage of this exhibition, he said, going on a long spell that I tried my best to keep track of. It reminded me of 2 games from my past, and it also told me that Grandmother Mito had more of a role in designing these than she let on. I'd told her about King of the Hill and Capture the Flag before. In fact, it was a game she enjoyed playing with me with figurines. Of course, we had these cool puppets powered by Fuinjutsu that could move in all sorts of ways. I guess designing this test like this was supposed to give me some sort of advantage. Just to clarify, the flags are not to be removed from their poles, and they must not be hidden at all during the task. Does everyone understand the rules? He didn't wait for an answer. Good. You have 3 minutes to strategize among yourselves, Jiraiya finally said, and shut off the feed from his mic. The crowd's buzzing nod at me as they chattered about the undoubtedly exciting task to themselves. I turned to both Yuzum and Toshiro and began to make signs at them. Focus on the flags? I asked first. Negative. That's what most of them will be thinking as well. Having to keep it openly displayed means we'd sooner end up in a situation like whoever gets the hill, without the benefit of the high ground, Yuzum replied, signing furiously. I thought over her words and nodded. It provided one advantage over the hill, mobility. But at the end of the day, we'd have to fight off everyone who wasn't going to scrap over the hills. I tried to come up with a plan, but literally the only other option was scrapping it for the top of the hill. I knew that was the option Yuzum preferred. Both because she was that type of person, and she literally just signed it at us. We'd have to fight at least half the people here by ourselves. And we have to make sure they don't stay on the hill in any large numbers because splitting those points would be terrible. I signed back. She wanted to sign something back before Toshiro stepped between us. Yuzum was no longer antagonistic with me, not as much as she used to be, but we were still far from friends. Teammates maybe, but not friends. I have an idea, his fingers said for him. How long will it take you to make a barrier that rejects outsiders? How long can you keep it up for? Both questions were addressed to me. Since I already know the script for an excellent one, it'll probably take about 3 minutes with clones. And as for keeping it up, I can go for hours if it isn't being assaulted. Under heavy assault, maybe 30 minutes, but I'd be dead on my feet afterwards. I said to him. Being a quarter Senju and a quarter Uzumaki meant I had chakra reserves that put some Jounin to shame. I wasn't Naruto, by any means. At about 6 shadow clones, I was tapped out. But I wasn't lacking when it came to reserves. Good. My idea is this. Yuzum and I buy you the time to make the barrier, and once you can get it up, we chill at the top of the hill. He signed. It was a good idea, I thought. Better than whatever I had. I signed that to both of them, and Yuzum signed her willingness soon after. She'd get to fight to her heart's content, so it probably soothed the battle lust in her Uchiha blood. I slapped myself at that thought. I was slipping up more and more. The more time I spent in the clan compound, reading scrolls from previous clan heads, and talking to Granduncle, the more anti-Uchiha propaganda was shoved down my throat. It was a subtle and insidious thing. Like how Senju Benimaru, the 17th clan head, had written that Uchiha had a natural lust for battle, ignoring that we Senju enjoyed fighting just as much as they did. We started half the conflict between our clans, after all. He even ignored Senju Kenpachi, who loved to fight so much that he came close to ending the entire Uchiha clan, but allowed the survivors to leave simply because he wanted them to get stronger and present him with a good fight. My thoughts were knocked out of my head as someone walked towards us. Izuku. He had both his teammates behind him. I smiled at him, and he smiled back. I saw your plan. We want in, he said. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to Toshiro. And my ever-affable teammate turned to him with a sharp smile on his face. Fuck off, I choked. I actually choked on air and had to bend over. I missed the next part of the interaction. We could just as easily ruin the entire plan if we wanted to. Let us in. Besides, if you want to cover Mr. Seal Master over there, then the two of you won't be enough, he said. Hold on, how did you even know our plan? I cut in before Toshiro could reply. He flashed his Sharingan for a second, and I almost face-bombed. Of course. The point is, we want in. We have the numbers to help you make this thing work, he said, still talking to Toshiro. Fine. But you'll do precisely as I say. Sure thing, Captain, he said with a sincere smile on his face. Now that I'm in on this, I say you should probably stop assuming you're the only ones who speak Humbu code. I saw Yuram peeking at you guys earlier with her eyes, and Shikaheim's gaze hasn't left your team since you started your little strategizing session, he said. I wanted to sink into the floor, embarrassed at making such a rookie mistake. I'd defaulted to standard operations protocol for missions, not computing that we were surrounded by Konoha Nin here. If anyone spoke the code in our year group, then Shikaheim, Izuku, and Yuram would be my first guesses outside of my team. Do you think they'll come for us? I asked him. Only a fool would try to fight both you and Yuzum-chan working together. They'll probably work around you guys. But if they get the chance, I doubt they'd hesitate. I nodded at his words. Good. Now let's complete the plan, he said, switching over to English. I smiled at the confused faces around us. Teaching the language to Izuku so we could plan pranks and pretending that I'd come up with it was reaping dividends even now. When he and Izuku HD completed the plan, he turned to his teammates and told them, just follow my lead when the buzzer rings. It's going to be a bit like Formation 7, but you'll notice the twist when it happens. Toshiro nodded with a shrug, but Hyun looked between Izuku and me for a few tense seconds. Almost like she was deciding whether it would be a good idea to play ball or not. Finally, she signaled her capitulation with a slow nod. I gave her one back, thankful. I wasn't an idiot. This plan would be noticeably more difficult without her cooperating. She was easily one of the strongest genin here, after all. I turned to Izuku's team and watched him communicate with both Kazuru and Omoikane. Watching that reminded me that I hadn't seen much of the Kurama heir lately. Omoikane and I were more distant friends, so it was understandable that we didn't see as often, but Kazuru was one of my best. I walked forward, moving past Izuku once he was done, and placed a hand on Kazuru's shoulder to catch his attention. He looked up at me, startled. I smiled to calm him down, but that didn't work as well as it should have. He still blushed in embarrassment, and stepped backwards. How have you been, Kazuru? We missed you at the last gathering, I said to him, silently asking the question. I've been lovely, Shori. I had lessons with some clan elders that couldn't really be skipped. Maybe you'll get to see what I learned in the next stage, he said with a smile that I returned. Of course, our conversation was brought to a quick end by the sound of the buzzer. I turned to the screen and found that it was beginning a countdown. 7 seconds left. We'll catch up once this is over. I promise, I said, and turned to face the hill we'd chosen to die on. The one to the left, which had a higher proximity of foreign shinobi close to it, and crucially had neither of the two foreign teams that had caught my attention. Sharp, I muttered to myself as I prepared to jet off. The screen counted down to 1 and then there was the sound of a horn. I smiled as I disappeared in a body flicker that took me right to the base of the hill. I quickly began to climb, ignoring most of the obstacles, and noting their presence when both Yuzum and Izuku appeared behind me in short order. I crested the top of the hill first. Yuzum followed shortly after. Toshiro and Izuku mounted it at the same time. I turned in a swift movement, and formed a seal. The next body to jump over was riddled with air bullets. The water clones splattered to the floor, and the Mizu Genin with the rebreather jumped right up immediately afterwards, tossing a bunch of shuriken my way. I transitioned from the bird seal to the snake seal, and a mud wall caught the projectiles before they hit me. She was forced to end her attack as Yuzum dove right at her and kicked her back towards the ground. She landed on the hill, and they began to engage in furious taijutsu. One of her teammates crested the hill next, but they found Izuku waiting for them with flashing red eyes. The next people to complete the journey were Kazuru and Omoikane. I nodded at them and got to work. First things first, I took my scroll of my back and unrolled it. Much like the scroll my grandfather had carried, this was a complicated sealing matrix that basically stored a bunch of shit. I tapped one of the seals, seemingly at random, and funneled my chakra into it. After a massive puff of chakra smoke, I found myself holding a massive sealing brush with an inkware next to me. I smiled and dipped the brush into the ink and began to paint the ground with my seals. I was no stranger to barrier techniques. No one who had spent years under an Uzumaki sealing master could claim to be unfamiliar with barriers. I knew I was more conversant than most. I knew multiple barriers that would serve our purposes. I also knew a few that would be even easier to set up. I could always set up something like the 4 Violet Flames formation with a few shadow clones, but there was every chance I'd run out of chakra trying to keep such a powerful seal active throughout the task. Asuna Shinobi appeared in my blind spot with a blade thrust at my neck. I ignored the attack and watched them turn their blade on themselves and stab it into their own stomach. Yuzum appeared soon after and kicked him down the hill. I nodded at Kazura with a smile and sent my thanks to Yuzum with a nod. The former smiled back, but the latter merely grunted. "Get that seal done. We're under a lot of pressure," she said before disappearing towards another Suna Genin. Part of me wanted to study the Suna wind release in action, but I couldn't spare the focus. This wasn't a seal I had mastered. I couldn't draw it with my eyes closed, so I very much had to remain focused on every brush stroke, especially since I was drawing directly on the stone surface of the hilltop. When I completed the seal, I turned to the flag beside me and whistled to draw attention to myself. I picked up the flagpole, and holding it like a javelin, I tossed it right in the direction of the platform we'd come from. A few shinobi broke off to chase the flag, and both teams had an easier time shoving everyone off the hill. Once I was sure only our teams remained, I slammed my palm on the seal and poured my chakra into it. After that, I began to weave seals at a furious pace. Ram hare snake dragon rat ox tiger hare snake dragon rat ox tiger ox snake tiger hare horse dragon rat snake rat ox tiger hare snake. Barrier gate 5 seals technique. Castle closing 8 gates I pronounced. 5 gates rose around us. That was stage 1. They then began to spread out red energy in the form of a barrier that linked all of them. "Well, that was a success," I said with a smile. And then my shadow bulged before a head rose out of it. A head that was quickly followed by a set of hands. If the head hadn't had a very recognizable pineapple hairstyle, then I would have smashed it into the ground. Shikaheim rose out of my shadow with a smile on her face. "That was a superb plan," she said. I could tell Yuzum wanted to either punch her in the face or roast her to death with a great fireball, so I stepped in to stand in front of my cousin. "What are you doing, Shikaheim?" I asked her, voice stern. "What do you think? I noticed that plan of yours and decided I wanted it," she said. "This doesn't work with 3 teams, Shika. The split isn't profitable like that," I pointed out. She smiled. "Not necessarily. I just have to be in the top 5 teams to make it out of this mess. Choni and Inokin are outside this nifty barrier, working to get points for us any way they can. This is just insurance." "Well, your insurance seems to be ruining things for us," Izuku butted in. "Consider it revenge for my cute little cousin almost killing us at the end of the first task." "I apologized for that already. I had no real way to know that you'd be the ones to make it first. And I had every confidence that anyone in your group would have been able to escape that with ease," I said. "I played much worse pranks on the class as a whole during our time at the academy." "Well, I accepted your apology. This is just payback. We're even now," she said. I turned towards the scoreboard, noticing that our teams were nowhere near the top 5. Receiving 6.5 points every 30 seconds would add up to about 130 points for the 10-minute task, but that was assuming we had the whole 10 minutes. The seal had taken me 2 minutes and some change to put up. That meant we lost some points from that period as a result of having so many teams around. Calculating it, I figured we'd have about 110 points at the whole task if nothing changed. On the other hill, both the Kumo and IWA teams were duking it out with a reckless abandon. The kind of abandon that spurred something in me. That hill's flag was currently in the possession of the Kumo team, but they were under consistent pressure from the IWA team. None of the other teams were even choosing to contest that particular hill. Beyond those wasting their energy against my barrier, the rest were fighting over the other flag for those 200 points. It was a tense standoff, as all 7 of us stared at each other in the barrier. After a minute, even the Mizunin had abandoned trying to break the barrier to try their hands at acquiring the flag. The fight between the IWA and Kumo teams remained at a consistent hot point. Every eye was on the exchange. The free-for-all that had begun on the stage for the other flag was also another source of tension. From the way things looked, at least one Kusa Genin had been killed. A Suna Genin with some affinity with poisons had incapacitated a whole Kiri team, and the remaining Kiri team was teaming up to launch some devastating combo jutsu to wear down the Suna group. Choni and Inokin weren't easy to find, but I was sure they were waiting and biding their time to snatch that flag at the last moment. It was the kind of thing they'd do. I'd love to see how it would pan out though, since it was clear that Yuram's team was winning the free-for-all as it stood now. I'd always wondered what a Hyuga who took ninjutsu seriously would look like, and Yuram was showing me that. Her wind ninjutsu were punishing. Kuro was a whirlwind as he and Shiro swept through the approaching horde with devastating taijutsu. They never let themselves get bogged down for too long, and they used both the Beast-Man and Man-Beast transformations to great effect. The boy you were fighting could become a dog at any second and vice versa. They were almost single-handedly displaying the power of Konoha's rich Teki Genkai arsenal. Shiba was the one placed in charge of physically keeping hold of the flag, and he was doing that with ease. Whoever managed to make it past either of his teammates would find themselves swallowed in a storm of insects. Not just any insects, but bugs bred with a special taste for flesh. One Taki Genin had forfeited after having his arm eating down to the bone as he tried to fight through Shiba's cloud. Everyone had given him a wide berth since then. Another minute passed, and I made up my mind. The barrier would consume way less chakra than predicted since no one was even bothering to attack it. I crossed my fingers, and a clone appeared in a puff of smoke. He sat down and sized it to focus on maintaining and altering the barrier as I needed. I'm leaving, I told my teammates. They'd both clearly been doing the same calculations as me, so Toshiro nodded while Yuzum stepped up to join me. If there was anyone who understood my battle lust, it would be her. If there was anyone who would support my actions, it would be her. The barrier shifted to make a small gap that I wasted no time passing through. I ignored Izuku and Kizuru as they joined Yuzum and I in crossing the barrier. For this, it would be every team for themselves. I assume you know what we'll be hunting, I said, turning to her. Her smile was sharp. We jumped off the hill as one.